two worlds wanted Harry Potter dead. His enemy because of a prophecy, and his own home because of a file. Only one person refused, the demon who raised him, who carried the apocalypse in his own flesh and taught a boy with a dark lord behind his scar the one lesson that would save the world. You are not the thing inside you. You're what you do with it. This is what happens when the boy who lived is raised by Hellboy. The full story starts now.
The needle on the resonance meter had been climbing for 40 minutes, and Hellboy had spent every one of them hoping it would stop. It didn't. By the time the Bureau's gray sedan came over the last rise, and the West Country spread itself out below in the dark, hedgerows, a church spire, a single street of crooked houses with their lamps lit against the cold. The needle had pinned itself all the way over and bent gently against the brass stop, the way a dog leans into a door it once opened. Whatever was waiting in the village of Godric's Hollow was the loudest thing the instrument had ever heard. It had no idea what to do about being that loud. Neither did Hellboy. "You ever notice," he said to the driver, a junior field tech named Whitcomb who had not said a single word in 2 hours and was now gripping the wheel like it might try to leave, "how the readings are always worst right before somebody tells me it's nothing. Faulty gear. Atmospheric whatchamacallit, some farmer's bull got loose." Whitcomb did not answer. The meter ticked against its stop, soft and steady like a clock that had given up on minutes. "Yeah," Hellboy said. "That's what I thought too." He was a big man, if man was the word, and the sedan had not been built with him in mind. His right hand, the one the Bureau filed under equipment rather than anatomy, sat in his lap like a chunk of red masonry, fingers curled, knuckles the size of doorknobs. He had filed his horns down to 2 pale stubs that morning, the way he filed them every morning, the way some men shaved, and the stubs ached a little in the cold the way an old brake aches before rain. He rolled a cigar from one side of his mouth to the other and watched the church spire grow. It was 31 October 1981, and it was very quiet, and the quiet was the wrong kind. He had learned the difference a long time ago. There was the quiet of a place where nothing had happened yet, which had a held-breath feeling to it, a maybe. And there was the quiet of a place where everything had already happened and the world simply hadn't caught up. This was the second kind. The street was empty. The lamps were lit. There was a smashed jack-o'-lantern grinning up out of the gutter, its candle long out, and not a soul in any window. "Pull over here," Hellboy said. "End of the lane." He got out before the car had fully stopped because the smell had reached him and there was no point pretending it hadn't. It was 2 smells, braided together, and he knew them both. The first was the one the meter had been screaming about for 40 minutes. Ozone and struck match and the green rot of an open grave. The unmistakable cologne of a thing that had been summoned or poured or made to be where it had no business being. It hung over the whole street like a low ceiling. The second smell was simpler and worse. It was the smell of a house that had recently held people who were no longer alive. The house at the end of the lane had been a nice one, the kind of cottage that turned up on biscuit tins. Now the top corner of it had been blown out, beams jutting up at the sky like the ribs of something that had washed ashore, the thatch scorched back from a hole punched clean through the roof. The front door stood open. No light inside. Hellboy stood at the gate and looked at the hole in the roof and felt the old, tired weight settle onto his shoulders, the one he carried to every job and never got used to. He had walked into a lot of houses with their roofs blown off. It never started good and it rarely ended better. "Stay with the car," he told Whitcomb without turning around. "Anybody comes down that lane, anybody, I don't care if it's the milkman, you flash the lights twice and you keep your hands where they can see 'em. These are not our usual neighbors." "How do you know," Whitcomb managed, "what our usual?" "Because the gear says so, kid, and because nobody's screaming." He stepped through the gate. "Screaming I can work with, quiet's the part that worries me." The garden path was cold under his hooves. There was frost coming early. He could feel it gathering in the grass. He went up the path to the open door, and the meter clipped to his coat began to tick faster, and then faster, and then it simply held a single long note, the way a kettle does right before it screams. He found the first body inside the front door. A young man, dark-haired, glasses knocked sideways, lying on his back in the hole as if he'd sat down hard and decided to stay. There wasn't a mark on him. That was the thing Hellboy noticed and didn't like. There was not a single mark. People did not simply lie down and stop. The dead had reasons, usually, and the reasons were usually visible, and the absence of a reason was its own kind of reason, and it was never a good one. Whatever had done this had done it the way you turn off a lamp, no struggle that left a print, just on and then off. Or hell, Hellboy said quietly to the young man, because somebody ought to say something. "Sorry, kid, looks like you got in the way of something." He stepped over him, careful, the way you're careful around the recently dead, even when you've done it 1,000 times, because 1,000 times is exactly how you forget, and that's when it gets you. He went deeper into the house. The smell of the summoned thing was strongest at the foot of the stairs, where the air had a faint oiliness to it, a residue, the way a room smells after a fire even when the fire is days out. Something enormous had stood here. Something enormous had stood here and then, abruptly, had not, and that was the part the meter couldn't make sense of, the part that kept the needle pinned and trembling. The thing was gone, but the readings said it was still here. Both at once, gone and here. There were only two things that read like that in Hellboy's long and unpleasant experience. One was a haunting, which was a thing that died and didn't leave. The other was much rarer and much worse, and he did not let himself think the name of it yet, because naming things made them realer, and he had a rule about that. He went up the stairs. The smell got worse, and the cold got deeper, and the meter held its long, flat note, and at the top of the stairs there was a second open door and a nursery behind it, and a woman on the floor. She was young, too. Red hair fanned out around her head like she'd been caught under water. She had died between the door and the crib, and from the way she lay, arms still half-flung, body still half-turned, Hellboy could read the last second of her life as clearly as if it had been written on the wall, which, in a manner of speaking, it had. She had not died running away. She had died standing in front of something, with her arms out, putting herself between it and the thing behind her. And Hellboy had spent 60 years in the company of monsters and demons and the architects of the apocalypse, and he had never once stopped being undone by this particular arrangement of a body. The body of someone who had stood their ground over a cradle, because it was the bravest thing in the world, and it almost never worked. It had worked. That was the thing. That was the thing the meter was trying to tell him and couldn't, the thing the whole Wrong Quiet Street had been holding its breath around. He understood it the instant he saw the crib was occupied. The thing that had stood at the foot of the stairs, the enormous summoned poured into the world thing, it had come up here to finish the job, and it had not finished the job. And the reason it had not finished the job was lying on the floor with her arms still out, and her last second still legible in the angle of her shoulders. And in the crib, very small, very awake, not crying, that was the part that made the hair stand up on the back of Hellboy's neck. The not crying was a baby. He crossed the room and looked down into the crib. The kid looked back up at him. Black hair, too much of it for a head that size. Green eyes, the mother's eyes, gone wide and solemn and fixed on the enormous red thing that had appeared above him, which would have sent any sensible adult through a window, and which this baby regarded with the grave, unhurried attention of someone deciding whether to be impressed. There was a cut on his forehead, fresh, beaded with blood just over the right eye, and it was not shaped like an accident. It was shaped like a letter from an alphabet nobody used anymore. A jagged stroke. A bolt. The meter against Hellboy's coat stopped its long, flat note. It started instead to tick. Slow, deliberate, coming from the crib. Hellboy went very still. He had been wrong on the stairs about the two things that read like gone and here at once. There was a third thing, and he was looking at it, and it was so much worse than the other two that, for a second, he simply stood there with his cigar gone cold in his mouth and his stone hand hanging at his side and did not breathe. The summoned thing was gone, yes. It had come into this house wearing a body, a man's body probably, and it had killed the young man downstairs, and it had killed the young woman here, and then it had tried to kill the baby, and it had, what? Failed, rebounded, cracked itself on something. The mother's last second was still hanging in the air of the room, that arms-out shape, and whatever she'd done, whatever she'd spent herself to do, it had turned the thing's own power back on it like a slammed door, and the body it wore had come apart, and the thing inside it had been blown loose into the cold, but it had not gone all the way out. A piece of it, a splinter, a seed, a single sliver of whatever monstrous self the summoned thing had been, had gone into the boy. Through the cut, into the small, soft skull behind it. And it was in there now, alive, the way a tick is alive, and the meter was ticking because the meter could hear it, and Hellboy could feel it. A cold, wrong pulse just under the warmth of the kid, a second heartbeat that was not a heartbeat, sealed up behind that little bolt-shaped scar. The baby was not a victim. Hellboy made himself think the word because pretending didn't change anything, and he had a rule about that too. The baby was a vessel. "Oh, kid," he said, and his voice came out rough. "What did they do to you?" The baby reached up. One small hand, fingers spread, grabbing at the air between them, grabbing, Hellboy realized, at the enormous red hand hanging at his side, the equipment hand. The one that was technically the key to the end of the world, and that mothers across 3 continents had snatched their children back from. The baby wanted to hold it. Hellboy looked down at the little reaching hand and then at his own, and something old and complicated moved through him, something he didn't have a clean word for and didn't go looking for one. Because he knew this. Of everything in the wide and terrible world, of every haunting and demon and folkloric horror he had ever been pointed at and told go fix it. This, the small wrong pulse behind a child's scar, the seed of a monster sleeping in a thing that hadn't done anything to deserve it. This was the one thing Hellboy understood all the way to the bottom. He had a seed like that. He had been carrying it for 60 years. It sat in his right hand and in the shape of his skull where the horns wanted to grow, and it had a name and a destiny and a crown waiting for it. And every morning of his life, Hellboy got up and filed the crown down to stubs and went to work. And that was the whole secret. That was the entire trick. That was the only thing he had ever figured out that was worth telling anybody. You are not the thing inside you. You're what you do with it. Every day, on purpose. Forever. Nobody had ever told him that. He'd had to figure it out the hard way, alone, with the whole apparatus of the apocalypse leaning on him to grow the horns and put on the crown. He'd figured it out anyway, mostly because of one old man who'd refused to be afraid of him. He looked at the reaching baby and the cold ticking seed behind its scar, and he made the call right there, before he'd thought it through, before he'd cleared it with anybody, the way he made all his best and worst decisions. "Yeah," he said. "Okay, yeah." He reached into the cuff of his coat with 2 thick fingers and worked loose the thing he kept there, the way other men keep a lucky coin. It was a horseshoe nail. Old, square-shanked, black with age, cold iron, hand-forged, the kind of thing that had been stopping the wrong sort of visitor at country doors since before anybody wrote it down. He'd carried it for 30 years. He pressed it gently into the baby's open palm and closed the tiny fingers around it, his own enormous hand swallowing the gesture whole. "Listen to me, 'cause I'm only gonna say this once and you won't remember it, but it's true anyhow." His voice had gone low, the cigar forgotten, the room with its 2 dead parents holding very still around them. "Cold iron and a true name'll stop most things in this world. Most, not all, but it's a place to start, and starting's the hard part." The baby's fist tightened on the nail. "You got something bad in you. That's not your fault, and it's not the end of the story. I got something bad in me too. Doesn't get to decide anything. You hear me? It doesn't get a vote." The baby yawned hugely, and the bolt scar pulled, and behind it the cold thing ticked, slow and patient and ancient, waiting out a wait it had all the time in the world for. "We'll see about you," Hellboy told it. That was when he heard the motorcycle. He heard it before he should have, because it was not coming up the lane. It was coming down, out of the sky, throttling back, a great rattling roar descending through the cold dark over the broken roof. And Hellboy got to the shattered window in 3 steps and looked out, and there was, in fact, a motorcycle landing in the back garden. A flying motorcycle, with a sidecar, ridden by the single largest human being Hellboy had ever seen who wasn't on his own side of the ledger. The man was nearly Hellboy's height and twice as wide, wrapped in a moleskin coat the size of a tent, with a wild black beard you could have lost a badger in, and his enormous face as he cut the engine and saw the blown-out house simply fell apart. Crumpled. The man took one look at the ruin of the cottage and made a sound Hellboy felt in his chest, a great cracked, wordless sound of grief, and Hellboy, who had been ready for a lot of things, was not ready for that. "Oh, no," Hellboy said under his breath. "Don't be a nice one, anything but a nice one." He went down the stairs, the baby gathered against his chest in the crook of his stone arm, the nails still clamped in the tiny fist, and he came out the back door into the cold garden as the giant was climbing off the motorcycle with tears already streaking into his beard. And the two of them stood there in the frost and looked at each other, and for a long moment nobody moved. Yea or not, the giant started and stopped and squinted, and his red-rimmed eyes traveled up Hellboy and up and up. "Blimey, what in the name of—" "Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense," Hellboy said. He'd found, over the years, that leading with the full official mouthful bought him about 3 seconds while people tried to figure out which words to be scared of. "You'd be from the Wand Crowd, the Ministry?" "Aye." The giant drew himself up, which was considerable. "Rubeus Hagrid, Keeper o' Keys and Grounds at Hogwarts, and I'll thank ye to put him down, sir, cause that there's Harry Potter and I'm under strict orders from Professor Dumbledore himself to bring him." His voice broke clean in half. He scrubbed at his face with a hand like a Christmas ham. "To bring him to his aunt's, he's to be looked after, he's to be safe." "Harry, so the kid had a name," Hellboy filed it away. "His aunt's," Hellboy repeated. "Right, and his aunt, she know what's in him," Hagrid blinked. "What's? He's a baby, what do ye mean what's in him? That's what I figured." Hellboy shifted the baby a little, settling him. Behind the bolt scar the cold thing ticked slow, and Hellboy watched Hagrid for any sign he could hear it. There was none. The big man couldn't hear it at all. None of them could. That was the whole problem. That was 60 years of his life in one frozen garden. "Look, Hagrid, I'm going to level with you because you've had a rotten night and you loved these people. I can see that, and you deserve straight talk. There is a piece of something in this child. Came off the thing that did this." He tipped his head back toward the house, the 2 bodies, the hole in the roof. "It's the worst kind of something I know how to find, and I've been doing this a long, long time. You take this kid to a nice house with a nice aunt and a normal life. That thing in his head is going to grow up right alongside him with nobody watching it, nobody who can even hear it, and one day it's going to be done being patient. That's not a maybe. That's a when." Hagrid's enormous face worked. He was not a stupid man, Hellboy could see that. Whatever he looked like, he was a grieving one, which was different. "Dumbledore," Hagrid said, with the desperate certainty of a man clinging to a name. "Dumbledore'll have thought of all that. Dumbledore's there's protections, old magic." "His mum," the voice cracked again. "His mum died for him. That counts for summat in our world. That's a protection no one can break, and there it was." Hellboy felt it land, soft and terrible. The thing the mother had done upstairs with her arms out, it wasn't just brave. It had been magic, real and old and strong enough to slam a monster's power back into its teeth. He could feel the residue of it still wrapped around the baby like a coat, warm where the seed was cold. The mother's love made into armor. He believed Hagrid about that. He believed it completely. It was the most powerful thing in the garden, more powerful than the nail in the baby's fist, more powerful than the red hand cradling him. But love armored you against attack from outside. It did exactly nothing about the thing that was already in. "She did," Hellboy said quietly. "She did die for him, and it worked, you understand. It worked. Whatever she did up there, it's the only reason this kid's breathing, and it's wrapped around him right now thick as a blanket. Your old magic's real. I'm not telling you it isn't." He let that sit, because it was true and because the big man needed it to be true. But your old magic's looking out. It's standing guard at the door, and the thing I'm worried about already got in before the door shut. It's inside the house, Hagrid. And there's nobody in your whole world who can even tell it's there but me." Hagrid stood in the frost with the broken motorcycle ticking behind him and the broken house ticking in front of him. An enormous grieving man caught between two sets of orders. The ones Dumbledore had given him and the ones his own gut was starting to give. And Hellboy watched him and waited and did not push, because you didn't push a man this size and this sad, you let him get there. "He'll come for him," Hagrid said at last, very low. "You know that, you take him off tour wherever it is ye lot keep yourselves, he'll come for the boy. He's not gone, not really, not him. They'll all say he's gone, but he ain't, I can feel it, and when he comes back he'll want the boy that beat him, and ye won't have Dumbledore, ye won't have any of us." "Yeah," Hellboy said, "I figured he'd come too." He looked down at the baby, who had fallen asleep at last against the warm red bulk of his chest, the nails still locked in one fist, the cold seed ticking behind the bolt scar, patient as a glacier. "That's kind of the point, big guy. When he comes for the kid, and you're right, he will, I'd rather the kid was raised by people who knew what was coming, who could hear it ticking, instead of a nice aunt in a nice house who never had a prayer." He met Hagrid's streaming eyes. "I can't promise you he'll be happy. I'm not going to stand here and lie to a man who just lost his friends, but I can promise you he'll be ready, and in my experience that's worth more than safe, because safe doesn't last and ready you get to keep." For a long moment Hagrid said nothing. The frost came down. Somewhere far off a church clock began, slowly, to strike midnight, and the street stayed empty, and the two impossible men stood over a sleeping child in the wreckage of a small good life. Then Hagrid took a breath that shuddered the whole barrel of him, and he reached into the vast inner pocket of his moleskin coat. And Hellboy's hand twitched toward Good Samaritan out of pure reflex before he saw what it was. A square of folded parchment and a small soft thing wrapped in cloth. The big man crouched. It brought his great wet face level with the sleeping baby's, and he tucked the cloth bundle gently into the blanket beside the boy. A toy, a small knitted stag, lopsided, clearly handmade. "Was his dad's," Hagrid said, thick. "James'd want him ter have summat." He looked at Hellboy and his chin came up, and for just a second under the grief, Hellboy saw the bedrock the man was built on. "If ye are lyin' ter me, if ye hurt him, there ain't a place in this world ner the next ye can hide from me. Ye understand, I'll find ye." "I believe you," Hellboy said, and he did. "Then look after him." Hagrid straightened, and the decision had cost him everything, and he stood there having paid it. "And I'll tell Dumbledore the protection took him. The old magic spirited him off somewhere safe where even we can't find him for his own good. It's not even a lie, not really. Look at him." His voice nearly went again. "He's safe as houses in that great red arm, and I dunno why I know it, but I do." And that was how the wizarding world came to spend the next 15 years, believing that Harry Potter had been hidden by his mother's dying magic in some unfindable place. Which, as Hagrid had said, was not even really a lie. The residue of Lily's charm hung around the boy for years, warm and bright, and it confounded every spell sent to look for him, exactly as a thing that loved him would have wanted. The Ministry searched. Dumbledore searched. They never thought to check a concrete bunker under a mountain, because nobody in their world knew the bunker existed, and the few who did were not the sort to answer letters. Hagrid got onto his great rattling motorcycle and wiped his face and looked once more at the bundle in Hellboy's arm. And then he opened the throttle and rose roaring into the dark and was gone. And Hellboy stood alone in the frost with a sleeping orphan and a cold cigar and the worst readings of his career going quiet at last against his coat. "Well," he told the baby, "just you and me and the end of the world then." He went back to the car. It was nearly dawn when they reached the airfield, and full dark again by the time the Bureau's transport set down in Colorado, and the long elevator carried Hellboy and his small cargo down into the mountain, past the checkpoints, into the warm, fluorescent hum of home. Professor Bruttenholm was waiting at the bottom, because of course he was. The old man never slept when Hellboy was in the field, hadn't in 50 years. And he stood there in his cardigan, with his reading glasses pushed up into his white hair and his hands folded and his sharp old eyes going straight to the bundle. "That," said Bruttenholm, "is not a relic, Hellboy. Nope. That is a child." Sharp as ever, Professor. Bruttenholm came closer. He had the look on his face that Hellboy had been bracing for the whole flight, the careful neutral look the old man used when he was about to say something Hellboy wasn't going to like, and Hellboy got there first, because he always did. "Before you say it," Hellboy said. "Yeah. There's something in him. Reads worse than anything I've ever carried. Came off whatever did his parents, a piece of it, lodged in behind a scar on his head, and it's awake, and it's smart, and it's gonna grow." He shifted the baby so the old man could see the little bolt over the sleeping eye. "I know what you're gonna ask. You're gonna ask if it's contained. And the honest answer is I got no idea, and neither will the lab, because nobody's ever brought one of these in still attached to a kid before." Bruttenholm looked at the scar for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was very gentle and very tired, and it carried 50 years of having had exactly this argument in slightly different clothes. "You know what the Bureau will say. You know what I should say. A vessel of that class is a containment problem, Hellboy. It is not a son. There are protocols. There are people whose entire job is to be in the room when something like this is brought in, and not one of them is going to look at that scar and see a boy who needs raising." "I know," Hellboy said. "They will want to study it, manage it. They will want it where they can watch it, I know. And you want to take it home and raise it." Hellboy said, "Not it, he's got a name. Harry." He looked down at the baby, at the small fist still closed around the cold iron nail, at the lopsided knitted stag tucked against him, at the cold patient thing ticking behind the scar. And then he looked up at the old man who had once, a long time ago, walked into a different blown-open building and found a different baby with a different doom growing inside it, and had made a different decision than the protocols allowed. Had decided that the demon was a son and not a thing. And Hellboy said the only true sentence he had. The one the whole long night had been narrowing down to. "He's got a monster in him, Professor. So do I." He held the old man's eyes. "That's not the part that decides anything. You taught me that. I'm passing it on." Bruttenholm did not answer right away. The two of them stood in the humming light at the bottom of the mountain, the old man and the demon and the sleeping vessel, and something passed between the first two that did not need words and would have ruined the moment if anyone had tried to put them to it. Then Bruttenholm reached out slowly and rested 2 fingers very lightly on the baby's dark hair, and his old face did something complicated, and he said, "Then we had better wake the lab quietly. And not, I think, mention the word containment where the wrong ears might." He stopped, because a soft splash had announced Abe Sapien coming up out of the water tank in the next room, summoned by some instinct of his own, dripping and blue and luminous in the low light, and he had crossed to them without a sound the way he always did. And now he had laid one long webbed hand on the blanket over the baby's chest, the gentlest thing in the world, the touch of a creature who read minds for a living and had learned to do it kindly, and gone absolutely, completely still. The luminous color drained out of Abe's face. "Abe," said Hellboy, "buddy, you're doing the thing, you're doing the still thing. I hate the still thing." When Abe spoke, his voice was quiet, and it came from somewhere far down, and he did not take his hand off the child, as though he were afraid of what would happen if he stopped listening. "There are 2 heartbeats in this child," Abe said. "Yeah," said Hellboy. "I know, pal, that's the hole, that's why I brought him in. The thing in the scar. We know about the thing in the scar." "You misunderstand me." Abe's pale eyes came up, and they were frightened in a way Hellboy had seen perhaps twice in all the years he'd known him. "I have touched a great many sleeping things, Hellboy, cursed things, possessed things, things with horrors sealed inside them. They are quiet, they wait. They do not pay attention." His hand pressed very slightly over the small chest, over the cold, ticking second pulse behind the bowl-shaped scar. "This one is awake. This one is listening to us. This one is thinking." In the warm, humming dark at the bottom of the mountain, the baby slept on, his fist closed tight around a nail of cold iron. And behind his scar, the thing that had no business being alive turned its patient, ancient attention from one face to the next, to the demon, to the old man, to the creature from the water, and began, very slowly, to learn their names. The first thing Harry Potter ever learned to draw was a circle, and the first thing he ever learned about circles was that you did not break one until you were sure of what you'd caught. He was 5, and the floor of the disused hangar bay was cold against his knees, and Hellboy crouched beside him with a fist the size of a microwave, guiding a stub of white chalk in Harry's small hand around and around until the line met itself. There was a ring of coarse salt laid down outside the chalk, and a ring of iron filings outside the salt, and Harry had helped pour both, very seriously, with his tongue stuck out in concentration the way he'd seen Hellboy do it. "Okay," Hellboy said. "Now, what's the rule about circles?" "Don't break it till you know what's in it," Harry recited. And why don't you break it till you know what's in it? Harry thought hard. This was the part he always got slightly wrong, and Hellboy never let him off the hook for it, which Harry had already begun to understand was a kind of love. Because the circle isn't keeping it in, he tried. It's keeping it honest. It can't lie to you while it's inside, and it can't grab you, so you've got time to figure out its name. And once you know its name, it has to answer. A taboy. Hellboy ruffled his hair with 2 fingers, which on Hellboy was roughly the gesture another father might make with a whole hand, and Harry beamed. And the empty chalk circle sat between them holding nothing at all, because there was nothing to catch today. Today was just practice. But Harry liked practice. Practice was the one part of the strange, enormous world he lived in that he could get all the way right. It was a strange world, though Harry had no other to compare it to and so did not yet know it. He lived a quarter-mile down inside a Colorado mountain, in a warren of warm, humming corridors that smelled of concrete and machine oil, and faintly, always, the chlorine tang from Uncle Abe's water tank. His bedtime stories were read to him by a blue amphibian man who pronounced every word with the care of someone tasting it. His scraped knees were bandaged by a woman who could set a candle alight without matches and who flinched, sometimes, when she did it, as though the fire had spoken to her. His father was the literal beast of the apocalypse, who had a tail and filed his horns down to stubs every morning and who had once, Harry was given to understand, been summoned by Nazis. None of this struck Harry as remarkable. It was simply Tuesday. The monsters in his house were kinder than most of the men he would later meet in the world above, and he learned to love them before he ever learned there was anything unusual about loving them. He kept 2 things with him always. One was a lopsided knitted stag, going bald at the antlers from being held, that the grown-ups said had belonged to a father he didn't remember. The other was a black iron nail, square-shanked and old, that he'd apparently had since the night they found him, and that he slept with closed in his fist the way other children slept with thumbs in their mouths. When he was frightened, and even in that warm, safe place, Harry was frightened more than a child should be. Woken by dreams whose shapes slid away before he could name them, he held the nail until the metal went warm from his hand and the dream let go. He did not know why it helped. He only knew that cold iron, his father had told him, would stop most things in this world. What Harry did not know at 5 was that there was a thing in the world it was meant to stop, and that he was carrying it behind the small lightning-shaped scar over his right eye, and that everyone in the warm mountain who loved him also listened for it, all the time. The way you keep one ear on a sleeping baby in the next room. He was 7 the night Bruttenholm told him the truth, and he never afterward forgot that the old man told it to him as a fairy tale, because that was the most honest way there was. Bedtime in the bureau was Professor Bruttenholm's hour. He came to Harry's small room with its single-barred window onto a corridor. There were no real windows, a quarter-mile down, and he sat in the chair that was too small for him and read from books that were too old for anyone. And the books were full of folklore, which Harry loved, because the folklore was about people exactly like the people he lived with. witches with iron teeth, men who turned into bears, things that had to tell you their names if you asked 3 times. That night Harry had not wanted a story. He had wanted, in the blunt way of 7-year-olds, an answer. "Grandpa," he said. He called Bruttenholm Grandpa, and the old man had never once corrected him, and his eyes had gone bright the first time. "Why does Uncle Abe go quiet when he touches my head? And why does everyone look at my scar when they think I'm not looking?" Bruttenholm set the book down in his lap and was silent for a moment, and Harry understood, even at 7, that the silence was the old man deciding not to lie to him. It was a particular silence. He would come to know it well. "Because there is something asleep inside you, Harry," Bruttenholm said. "Behind the scar. It has been there since the night since the night Hellboy found you. And we listen for it because that is our work, and because we love you, and those 2 things turn out to be the same thing more often than people expect." Another child might have cried or been afraid. Harry, raised among monsters, simply asked the practical question, "Is it a monster?" "It is a piece of one, a very old, very clever kind." The old man's voice took on the cadence Harry knew, the story cadence, and Harry felt the room settle around it. "Let me tell you an old tale, and then you will understand your own better than anyone who only knows the new words for it. There was once a sorcerer called Koshe, and men called him the Deathless because he could not be killed. Swords would not bite him, fire would not burn him. Do you know why?" Harry shook his head against the pillow. "Because Koshe was clever and frightened, and being clever and frightened is a dangerous mixture. He took his own death out of his body the way you might take a coal out of a fire, and he hid it. He hid his death inside a needle, and the needle inside an egg, and the egg inside a duck, and the duck inside a hare, and the hare inside an iron chest, and the chest he buried beneath a green oak on an island no map remembered. And so long as the needle was safe, Koshe could not die, no matter what was done to the rest of him, because the part of him that could die was not in him at all. Do you see? He hid himself, Harry said slowly, so nobody could find the part that would break. He hid himself in things. Bruttenholm agreed, and there was something careful and deliberate in the way he said it. Planting a flag Harry would not learn to read for years. And that is the oldest and the worst kind of magic there is, older than any wand, older than this bureau, older than the very newest sort of sorcerer who thinks he has only just invented it. We have a whole file on it, here in the mountain, going back 100 years. We call it Koshe class. A death or a self hidden in a vessel. He laid 2 light fingers very gently on Harry's forehead, just below the scar. The thing asleep in you, Harry, is a splinter of such a self. Someone hid a piece of himself and the piece fell into you. That is all it is. A splinter, not your whole story. Not even the most interesting part of it. Can it be got out? Tales of that kind always have an ending, Bruttenholm said, and the endings are usually unkind because the men who write them have no love for the vessel. But they are endings, Harry, which means there is always a way. We simply intend to find a better one than the storybooks did. He picked the book back up. Now, one more rule before you sleep, and it is the most important one your father knows, so attend. What do you do when at last you find the true name of the thing inside the needle? Harry already knew. He'd known since he was small enough to draw a circle. You name it, he said, and it has to answer. You name it, Bruttenholm said softly, and it has to answer. And he read the rest of the story, and Harry held his nail, and somewhere behind the small lightning scar the splinter listened, patient as it had always been, learning the word Koshe the way it had learned all their names quietly and without forgetting. The snake came 2 years later, and that was the first time the rest of the mountain remembered to be afraid. It got into the containment wing through a ventilation gap, an ordinary thing. A Colorado bullsnake as long as Harry's arm that had no idea it had crawled into the most dangerous corridor on the continent. Harry was 9 and out of bed where he had no business being, padding down to the tank rooms because a dream had chased him out of sleep. The slid-away kind, the kind that left frost on the inside of his ribs. He found the snake coiled under the red glow of an emergency lamp, and it found him, and it lifted its head and tasted the air, and Harry, half asleep, frightened. his guard down in the particular way that mattered, opened his mouth to tell it that it was all right, that he wouldn't hurt it, that it should go home, and what came out was not English. It was a low, sliding hiss, shaped like words but made of cold, and the snake went still and tilted its head as though it had been addressed. And Harry's whole body flushed with that frost-on-the-ribs feeling, and he understood two things at once with a child's terrible clarity: that he had just spoken a language no one had ever taught him, and that it had not quite felt like him doing it. That was when Abe came around the corner. Abe Sapien did not gasp. He did not move quickly. He simply stopped in the red light, the way he had stopped once before over a cradle 8 years gone. And the luminous blue of him dimmed, and his pale eyes found Harry's. And Harry, who loved Abe, who had been read to sleep 100 times by that careful voice, watched his gentle uncle look at him the way you look at a thing in a tank. It only lasted a second. Abe mastered it. Abe was kind and quick, and he hated himself for the flinch even as it crossed his face. Harry could see that too. He came forward and took the snake up gently in both webbed hands and said, lightly, "You're up late, little fish," and walked Harry back to bed with one hand warm on his shoulder, and told him the snake was nothing, the wing was sealed, all was well. But at the door he paused, and he crouched, and he looked Harry very levelly in the eye, and he said the thing that Harry would carry for years, the thing that was the kindest and the most frightening anyone ever said to him. "You spoke to it in the dead man's tongue, Harry," Abe said softly. "The serpent speech. I have only ever heard it from one sort of thing in all my life, and that thing is in your scar, not in your heart. Do you understand the difference I am drawing? It is the most important difference there is." He pressed a cool hand briefly to Harry's chest, over the right heartbeat, the true one. "When the cold comes up in you, and the strange words come, and they will come again, I need you to remember that it is the passenger reaching for the wheel. It is not the driver. You are the driver. Whatever it sounds like, however certain it feels, you are the only one who gets to steer." Harry nodded, not understanding all of it, understanding enough. And for years afterward, when the frost came up under his ribs, he would put one hand over his true heart the way Abe had and feel for the difference, and the practice of feeling for that difference would one day be the only thing standing between him and the end of everything. But that was later. He was 10 the day the cold nearly killed someone, and 10 the day Liz Sherman saved him from being ashamed of it for the rest of his life. It happened in the training hall, which Harry by then half lived in, because he had worked out early and bitterly the central fact of his existence and had decided to do something about it. The fact was this: he was ordinary. He had grown up surrounded by the impossible, a father who shrugged off collapsed buildings, an aunt who breathed underwater, fire that came when it was cold, and he, Harry, was a small breakable boy with thin arms and ordinary blood who got winded running the corridor and bruised when he fell. He could not lift what they lifted, take what they took, do what they did. The one wild thing in him, the cold, did not obey him. It was not a power, it was a weather, and it came when it pleased and went where it pleased and frightened the people he loved. So he had decided, at 10, with the grim resolve of a child who has correctly diagnosed his own situation, that if he could not be strong, he would be attentive. He drilled. Not muscle, he had little to drill, but noticing. He learned to read a room the second he entered it. Exits, waits, what would burn, what would hold, where a thing might be hiding and what it would want. He learned that a small boy who sees the loose floor great 3 seconds before anyone else has, in those 3 seconds, more power than the strongest man in the room. He could not win a fight. He intended never to be in one he had not already half won by walking in first. But that day a training drone, a bureau contraption, a heavy floating thing that fired rubber rounds to teach agents to take cover, malfunctioned and dropped out of the air straight toward a junior tech with her back turned. And Harry, 10 years old, saw it half a second before anyone. And there was no time to notice his way out of it, no clever floor grate, no exit, just the raw animal need to stop the falling thing from hitting her. And the cold came up out of him like a held breath let go. It was not fire. Liz's power was fire, bright and screaming. Harry's was the opposite of fire, a wave of sucking necrotic chill that rolled out from him across the hall and frosted the steel and stopped the falling drone dead in the air. Saved the tech, yes. Dropped the machine cracked and rhymed with frost an inch from her head, but kept rolling, because Harry could no more stop it than he could stop a sneeze. And where it rolled, the green plants in the corner blackened, and the water in the cooler skinned over with ice, and the junior tech, unhurt, turned and saw the boy at the center of it with white breath pouring off him and his eyes gone strange, and she made a small sound and stepped back. And so did the others, all of them, the people Harry loved. Stepping back from the cold, dead thing he had become for 3 seconds in the middle of the room. He stood there shaking, and the frost melted off the walls, and nobody came to him. Then a door banged, and Liz Sherman crossed the whole length of the hall without slowing down and put her arms around him, straight through the last of the cold, and held on. "Yeah," she said, into his hair, fierce and quiet while he shook. I know, come here, I've got you." She walked him out, past all the careful, frightened faces, and she sat him down in the empty mess and got him cocoa with her own fire, boiled it in the mug with 2 fingers, casual, showing him on purpose. And she talked to him as no one else in his life ever quite had, not Hellboy's gruff comfort, not Bruttenholm's gentle stories, but the flat, unvarnished talk of one person to another who has stood in the exact same place. "I burned down a city block when I was a kid," Liz said. "Did you know that? Older than you, couple of years, everyone in it." She watched that land. "It wasn't fire I called. It was fire that called me, and I just happened to be standing where it came out. People stepped back from me for years. The way they stepped back from you just now, you saw it. I'm not going to pretend you didn't, because the worst thing about it is when people pretend." She turned the mug in her hands. "Here's the part nobody told me, and I'm telling you, so listen. The thing inside you that scares them, it is not the most important thing about you. It's the loudest thing. There's a difference, and the world's gonna spend your whole life trying to make you forget it. The cold's loud. You're the important part, the quiet part, the part that saw the drone falling and didn't think about itself for 1 second. She reached over and tapped his chest over the true heart, the way Abe had. "That part doesn't make any noise at all. That's how you'll know it's really you." Harry looked at her, at the woman who carried fire she'd never asked for, and had not let it make her cruel, and had crossed an entire room of frightened people to hold him, and something in him that had been clenched since the drill hall came loose, and he cried, finally, the way he hadn't, and Liz let him, and drank her cocoa, and did not step back. Oh, it was the most important conversation of his childhood, and he would not understand how important until he was much older, standing in front of a man made entirely of the loud, cold thing, with the whole quiet truth of himself the only weapon he had left. He was 12 when he finally asked his father about the horns. He'd watched Hellboy do it 1,000 times, the morning ritual, the file, the 2 pale stubs ground down where 2 great curving horns wanted to grow, and never asked, the way you don't ask about the most ordinary thing in the house. But he was 12 now, and he'd been thinking about the cold and about Kashay and about the dead man's tongue. And one morning he sat on the edge of the sink and watched Hellboy work the file and said, "Why do you do that? Every day, they just grow back." Hellboy didn't stop filing. "Yep. Every day. Grow right back every night too, like a chore. Like shaving, except the stubble's the apocalypse." He turned his head, checked the angle in the steel mirror, kept going. "You want the real answer or the one I give the new agents?" "The real one." Hellboy was quiet for a moment, the rasp of the file the only sound. "There's a thing I'm supposed to be," he said at last. "Was made to be, whole point of me far as the guys who summoned me were concerned. There's a crown that goes on these," he tapped the stubs, "and a name that goes with the crown, and a job, and the job is I open a door and everything ends. That's not a maybe, kid. That's what I'm for, the way a hammer's for nails. Everyone who's ever looked at me real close has seen it. Some of 'em wanted to stop it. Couple of 'em wanted to help it along." He set the file down. "And here's the thing nobody tells you about being made for something. The something doesn't go away just 'cause you don't want it. It's not a phase. It doesn't get bored and leave. It's there every single morning, patient as a glacier, waiting for the one day you're tired enough or scared enough or sad enough to let the horns grow out just a little, just to see. And the worst part, he met Harry's eyes in the mirror. The worst part is some mornings it'd be easier. The crown'd feel good, power always feels good going on, that's the whole trick of it. So why don't you, Harry asked, if it'd be easier? Because easy and right took one look at each other a long time ago and went their separate ways. Hellboy picked the file back up. I file him down because the day I stop is the day I let the thing inside me decide who I am instead of the other way round. And I don't get to decide that once, kid, that's the part they don't put in the stories. I don't get to be good once and have it stick. I gotta decide it again tomorrow. And the day after. Forever. Every morning with a file while my coffee gets cold. He shrugged his great red shoulders. That's not a curse. People think it's a curse. It's the opposite. It means I'm the one holding the file. Long as I'm the one holding the file, the horns don't get a vote. He held the file out, handle first, to his 12-year-old son. You got something and you wants to grow too. Cold thing, old thing. Someday it's gonna offer you the crown and it'll come the day you're tired enough to want it. When it does, you remember whose hand the file goes in. Harry took the file. It was heavier than it looked. He turned it over in his hands and he thought about the cold and the dead man's tongue and the snake and Kashay's needle hidden in its egg, and he thought, every morning, on purpose. Forever. And for the first time, the whole strange architecture of his life rearranged itself into something he could see the shape of. And the shape was this: that he had been raised from the cradle by people who carried monsters, precisely so that when his own monster offered him the crown, he would already know, in his hands and his bones and his cold, reluctant blood, exactly what to do with the file. He handed it back. "Forever," he said, "forever." His father agreed and ground the horns down to stubs, and they went to get breakfast. After that, the years went quickly, the way years do once you know who you are. Harry grew not much, never tall, but lean and quick and watchful, a young man who entered every room reading it like a page. He could not throw a punch worth a damn and never bothered to learn. He learned instead where the punch would come from and how to not be standing there. He could not cast a wizard's spell, having never been taught one, and his wild cold remained exactly what it had always been. A weather, not a weapon, faithful to no one, frightening when it came. But he learned the field agent's whole quiet trade. The salt and the iron and the silver, the sigils and the true names, the long, patient folkloric craft of knowing precisely what a thing was before you ever raised a hand to it. He went out by 16 on real cases, minor ones, supervised, his father's great shadow always a room away, and he was good at them, not because he was powerful, but because while everyone else was reacting, he was already 3 seconds ahead, watching the loose grate, knowing the name. The bureau stopped, slowly, stepping back from him. They never stopped listening to his scar, but they let him grow up, and he did. And the splinter behind the scar grew up too, in its way, in the dark, patient as a glacier, learning everything, every name, every face, every lesson Hellboy taught the boy about files and horns and crowns, filing them all away with the same cold attention. Because the thing about teaching a vessel how to refuse a monster is that the monster is in the room, taking notes. For 15 years it slept, and Harry held his nail, and the mountain hummed, and it was, against all the odds of his beginning, something close to a happy childhood. Then, on an ordinary gray morning in the autumn of his 16th year, every Cache-class instrument in the bureau woke up at once. They woke all across the mountain, in the labs and the archive and the deep cold vaults, needles slamming over, alarms shrilling, the old 100-year file of death's hidden in vessels lighting up like a switchboard as something, somewhere across an ocean, came back online and began to call to its scattered pieces. Bruttenholm went white in the archive. Abe surfaced streaming from his tank. Hellboy was halfway down a corridor with a cup of coffee when the alarms hit, and he stopped, and the coffee went still in his hand. And a cold dread he hadn't felt in 15 years climbed up the back of his neck, and he turned and ran, not toward the labs, but toward his son's room. He found Harry standing at the barred window in the grey light with one hand pressed to his forehead, and when he lowered it and turned around his face was strange, and his breath, just faintly, was fogging in a room that should have been warm. "Dad," Harry said, and his voice was very level, the way it went when he was most afraid. "It's warm." He touched the lightning scar again, almost wondering. "The scar, it's never been warm, not since the night you found me. Grandpa told me." He looked at his father, and the splinter behind his eyes looked out through him for just a half-second, ancient and awake, and finally, after 15 patient years, interested. And then it was only Harry again, pale and steady. A boy who had been raised his whole life for exactly this morning and had not, until this second, truly believed it would come. "It woke up," Harry said. "Didn't it?" Hellboy set down his coffee very carefully on the windowsill and put his great stone hand on his son's shoulder. "Yeah, kid," he said, "and it's calling home." For 3 days after the instruments woke, Harry could feel the ocean, not the water, the thing on the other side of it. It had started the morning the scar went warm, and it had not stopped. A pull, low and constant, somewhere behind his sternum and slightly to the east, the way a compass needle feels north without being told. When he stood still and let himself listen for it, which Abe had told him, gently, firmly, not to do, and which he did anyway because he was 16 and it was his, wasn't it the thing in his own head? He could almost count them. The pulls. Not one. Several. A scatter of cold little tuning forks strung out across a country he had never seen, each one humming at the exact frequency of the splinter behind his eyes. Each one calling, and the splinter answering, "Here, here, I'm here. Where are you?" A family of buried things finding each other in the dark after 15 years apart. "Stop doing it," Liz said the third evening, not looking up from her cards. They were in the mess. She'd been beating him at gin for an hour, mostly because he couldn't keep his attention in the room. "I can see you doing it. Your breath goes funny." "I'm not, Harry." She set the cards down. "Every time you reach out and feel for those things, the passenger gets to feel for them back. It's a two-way wire. You light it up, it lights up. You're not a radio that only receives." She tapped the table twice, the old gesture, quiet part, loud part. "Whatever's calling them home is going to notice that one of them is answering with a voice. You want to be careful how loud you sing back." He stopped. She was right. She was always right about this, the only one of them who'd lived inside a thing she didn't ask for. But even with his attention pulled back into the warm, bright mess, he could feel the pull at the edge of himself, patient, eastward, and he understood with a cold certainty that he and the rest of the Bureau were no longer asking whether this would become his problem. They were down to how. He found out how on the 4th day, when the wizards came. They came the way nobody had ever come into the mountain in Harry's lifetime. Announced. Bruttenholm called him to the briefing room with a face Harry had learned to read as "brace yourself," and on the way the old man told him, low and fast, the shape of it. The same event that had woken the Bureau's instruments had broken something else, far away, a concealment, old and strong, that had hidden Harry from the wizarding world since the night his mother died. Lily's charm. 15 years it had held, warm and bright, confounding every spell sent to find him. And the moment the network reactivated and Harry's scar lit up to answer it, the charm had finally, in lighting him up, given him away. "They found you the instant the thing inside you started shouting," Bruttenholm said. "Which means, my boy, that we are about to host the one man in their world who has been looking for you the longest. And I want you to understand something before you meet him, because it will save you a great deal of confusion." He stopped Harry with a hand on his arm outside the briefing room door. "He is not a bad man. He is, by most measures, a great one. But he has spent 15 years believing one terrible thing about you, and he is going to walk in here and discover that the terrible thing is true. And great men are never more dangerous than in the moment a terrible thing they believed turns out to be correct." Then he opened the door, and Harry met Albus Dumbledore. There were 2 of them. The first was the one Harry's eye went to and then could not look away from, an ancient man, taller than Harry expected and thinner, in robes the deep blue of a winter dusk. with a beard he could have tucked into his belt and half-moon spectacles and eyes that were. Harry registered with a small shock, kind. That was the part the briefing hadn't prepared him for. He had braced for a king, an inquisitor, a strategist. He had not braced for a tired, kind old face that looked at him the moment he came through the door and crumpled, very slightly, the way Hagrid's had over a broken house, before the discipline of decades smoothed it away. The second wizard Harry liked better immediately, because the second wizard was openly hostile and made no effort to hide it. And Harry had been raised to trust the man who showed you his contempt over the man who showed you his kindness. He was sallow and black-clad, with lank dark hair and an expression of permanent, refined disgust. And his black eyes raked the briefing room, the bureau's seals, Abe in his portable tank in the corner, Liz against the wall, Hellboy filling a doorway with his arms folded, and found them all equally beneath comment. Then his gaze reached Harry and stopped. Harry watched the sallow man look at him, and he watched something happen behind the black eyes that the man clearly had not authorized and could not call back. A flinch, deep and involuntary, as though Harry's face had reached out and struck him. The man's gaze went to Harry's eyes and held there, and his sallow face went a shade grayer, and his lips parted. And for a half-second the contempt was gone, and underneath it was something raw and very old and very like grief. Then it was over, sealed, and the contempt came back doubled to cover the breach. "Severus," Dumbledore said softly, without looking away from Harry, "are you quite well?" His eyes, the sallow man said. His voice was a cold drip. "He has her eyes." He said it as an accusation, as though Harry had stolen them. His gaze dropped then to the thing Harry held loosely in one hand, the knitted stag, gone bald at the antlers, that he carried still, a habit too old to break, and his mouth twisted into something that was trying very hard to be a sneer and was, Harry thought, mostly just pain. And his father's idiot taste in keepsakes, how perfectly, nauseatingly complete. "This is Severus Snape," said Dumbledore in the tone of a man diffusing something. "He knew your mother. They were children together. He has not, forgive him, he has not had the 15 years the rest of us have had to prepare for the sight of you." His blue eyes came back to Harry, and there was that crumple again, swiftly mastered. "And you are Harry. You are so very like them both that it is almost difficult to look at you. I am sorry. That is not a useful thing to say to a young man. Allow me to begin again properly." He inclined his head, grave and courteous, an old king greeting an heir he had lost in a war. "My name is Albus Dumbledore. I have been searching for you, Harry Potter, since the night you were taken from us, and I had begun to fear I would die without ever knowing what had become of you. It is the strangest of mercies to find you alive, and well, and—" His gaze flicked once to the great red figure in the doorway, and something complicated crossed it, and raised. "Though by hands I confess I never imagined." "Yeah," said Hellboy from the doorway, in the flat, unbothered voice Harry knew meant he was paying very close attention. "We get that a lot." They sat at the long table, and the two worlds looked at each other across it, and Harry had the surreal sense of watching two countries that had each believed themselves the whole world discover, with mutual offense, that they were neighbors. Dumbledore began. He spoke beautifully and at length, and Harry, who had been raised by people who said don't break the circle till you know its name and very little else, found the wizard's eloquence both impressive and faintly suspicious, the way you suspect anyone who can make a terrible thing sound graceful. He told them the shape of the war they had not known they were inside. A dark wizard, Dumbledore named him with visible reluctance, Lord Voldemort, and Harry noticed how the very syllables made Snape's jaw tighten and the room's temperature seem to drop, had tried 16 years ago to murder a baby because of a prophecy that named that baby his undoing. The curse had rebounded. The dark wizard had been unmade, all but destroyed, reduced to less than a ghost. And now, Dumbledore said, with the heaviness of a man confirming a thing he had prayed not to confirm, he was coming back. The instruments that had woken in the mountain had woken in the wizarding world too. The network was reactivating because its maker was reaching for his pieces. His pieces, said Bruttenholm, who had been listening with his fingers steepled and his old eyes bright, and who now leaned forward in the way Harry recognized as the scholar scenting a familiar bird. "Forgive me, Professor Dumbledore. I want to be precise, because precision is the only currency that spends in this room. When you say pieces, you are describing a man who has divided his own death and hidden the divisions in vessels so that he cannot be killed while the vessels endure. Yes." Dumbledore went very still. "You know of this magic. I know of it as the oldest crime there is." Bruttenholm rose and crossed to a cabinet and drew out a folder so thick it had to be held together with cord, a folder Harry had seen on the old man's desk his whole life, a folder he now understood for the first time. Bruttenholm laid it on the table between the two worlds and rested his hand on it as on a Bible. "Your people have a word for it, a new word, I would guess. A frightening, secret word that very few of you will say aloud, that you treat as the rarest and most unknowable of dark arts. Horcrux," Snape said, and the word landed in the room like a dropped knife. "Yes." Bruttenholm did not flinch from it. "A fine, sinister word. We have an older one." He patted the folder. "We call it a cachet vessel, after a sorcerer who hid his death in a needle, inside an egg, inside a duck, a great many centuries before your Lord Voldemort imagined he had invented anything. This file is 104 years old. It documents 19 confirmed cases on 5 continents. We have studied this exact crime since before your Ministry of Magic kept proper records, Professor, because while your world was busy hiding from the dark, ours was the one they sent into it." He let that sit, and Harry watched it land on Dumbledore, watched the ancient kind face absorb the news that the unknowable thing was, to these people, a numbered file, and watched something flicker there that Harry could not yet name but that Bruttenholm clearly could, because the old man pressed exactly there. "Which means I must ask you the question your whole world has apparently failed to ask itself. You believe these vessels must be destroyed. Yes, to make the man mortal again, every vessel must be unmade." "Yes," Dumbledore said quietly. "Then how many?" said Bruttenholm. "Have you found?" Dumbledore was silent. And in his silence Harry felt the whole room tilt, because he had been counting, hadn't he, for 3 days, across the ocean, with the pull behind his sternum, he had been counting the cold little tuning forks. And he knew, the way you know the number of stairs in your own house in the dark, how many there were. And he knew, with a slow rising horror that started in his stomach and climbed, that the Count Dumbledore was about to give, and the Count Harry carried in his own chest were going to be off by exactly 1. "We believe," Dumbledore said at last, choosing each word the way a man crosses a frozen river. "There are several objects of significance to him. A diary, a ring, others we have not located, the diadem of Ravenclaw, perhaps, a cup. We have been hunting them for some time, Severus and I, with very little to show for it, because they are hidden with extraordinary care, and we have had no instrument by which to find them." His blue eyes lifted, and they came slowly, with a tenderness that Harry suddenly and violently did not want pointed at him, to rest on Harry's face. On the scar. "Until, 4 days ago, every protective enchantment I have ever cast lit up at once to tell me where one of them had been all along. The room went so quiet Harry could hear Abe's tank filtering." "No," said Hellboy. He had not moved from the doorway, but his arms had come unfolded, and his stone hand hung at his side, and his voice had changed in a way Harry had heard perhaps 3 times in his life, gone low and even and entirely without humor, the voice that came out of his father in the last second before something in the world got broken. "I know where you're going," Hellboy said. "I've known where you were going since you walked in here being polite about it, so let's not take the scenic route. Say the thing, out loud, in front of the kid. You came all this way, you can afford the words." And Dumbledore, to his credit, Harry would think later, much later, when he could think about any of this without his hands shaking, did not flinch and did not dress it up, and did not look away from Harry while he said it. "The night Lord Voldemort tried to kill you," Dumbledore said, and his curse rebounded, a piece of his torn and ruined soul broke loose, and it attached itself to the only living thing in the room. To you, you have carried it your whole life behind that scar. You are not merely the boy he failed to kill, Harry. You are the last vessel. The one he made by accident and does not know he made and cannot reach for because it is the one piece of himself that has spent 16 years being loved. His voice did not break, but it cost him something not to. Harry could see it cost him. And the prophecy that named you is very clear, and I have turned it over for 16 years hoping to be wrong. Neither can live while the other survives. So long as the fragment in you endures, he cannot truly die. And so long as you live, the fragment in you endures. He folded his ancient hands on the table. I came here, Harry, having prepared myself across 15 years to tell a boy I had failed to protect that. In the end, the only way to free the world of Lord Voldemort is for that boy to lay down his life and let the last vessel be unmade with him. I had prepared myself to ask that of you gently as a kindness, as the hardest mercy of a long and bloody war. His blue eyes were wet. I did not prepare myself to ask it in front of the demon who raised you. That, I confess, I did not foresee. For a long moment nobody breathed. Harry sat very still and felt the words go into him the way the splinter had gone into him. All those years ago, through a wound that didn't show, the only way is for that boy to lay down his life, and he found, distantly, that he was not surprised. That was the worst part. Some buried part of him had always known. He had grown up in a building where the people who loved him listened to his scar like a sleeping baby, where the kindest uncle in the world had once looked at him like a thing in a tank, where his own grandfather had taught him the word cachet as a bedtime story and told him that the storybook endings were unkind, because the men who write them have no love for the vessel. He had grown up being prepared by gentle people for exactly this sentence, and the only thing that surprised him was how calm he felt hearing it spoken at last. The way you feel calm when a long-coming storm finally breaks and the waiting is over. Then his father started talking, and Harry stopped being calm, because Hellboy was furious in the way that mattered, the quiet way, and Hellboy was the only person in any world who had ever refused this kind of thing on Harry's behalf. "Here's a fun fact about me, Professor," Hellboy said. "Since we're all sharing today. There was a prophecy about me too, big one, said I was going to open a door and end the world, said it was what I was for. There were whole armies of guys, real smart guys, smarter than you even, all of them 100% sure the prophecy was the prophecy. And I was the lock, and the only sensible thing to do with me was either put me to use or put me down." He took one step into the room, and the floor seemed to feel it. "You know what I did with that prophecy? I filed my horns down and got a job. 60 years now, world's still here. Turns out the thing about prophecies is they're just somebody telling you what you're for, and the whole point of being a person instead of a hammer is you get to tell him where to stick it." He looked at Dumbledore, and there was no heat in it now, which was worse than heat. "You came into my house to tell my kid he's a vessel, like that's the end of the sentence. It's not the end of the sentence. It's the start of one. He's got a monster in him. So do I, so does half the people at this table. That's not the part that decides anything. He decides, and you—" The stone finger came up, not quite pointing. "You spent 15 years getting ready to ask a boy to die for your war, and you got so good at being gentle about it, you forgot to ask the only question that matters, which is whether there's another way. Because there's a man right next to you." He nodded at Bruttenholm, at the 100-year file, "who's been doing nothing but look for the other way since before your ministry could spell its own name." "There may be no other way," said Snape, and it was the first time he had spoken since the eyes, and his voice was vicious with something that was not quite cruelty. "In 104 years and 19 cases, Professor Bruttenholm, how many vessels did your file unmake without unmaking the thing that carried them?" His black gaze cut to Harry, and there was that raw thing under it again, the grief wearing a sneer. "How many living hosts walked away? Tell the boy the number. He has earned the number." Bruttenholm was silent. "Tell him," Snape said softly. "None," Bruttenholm said. "In every documented case, the vessel was an object, or a creature already lost." There is no record of a cachet splinter being drawn from a living human host and the host surviving. He looked at Harry, and his old eyes were steady and terrible and entirely honest, because he had never once in Harry's life been anything else. Because it has never been tried. Not because it cannot be done, because in 104 years, no one ever loved a vessel enough to try. The room held that. And Harry, 16 years old, the last vessel, the boy 2 worlds had been preparing to spend, looked from the kind old wizard who wanted him to die well, to the sallow one who wanted it not to be true, and hated him a little for being his mother's son, to his grandfather who had spent a lifetime looking for a door in a wall everyone else called solid, to his father who had told a prophecy to go to hell and made it stick for 60 years. And he understood that he was sitting at the exact center of an argument about whether he was a person or a problem, and that everyone in the room loved him, and that love was not going to be enough to settle it, because they all loved him toward different ends. So he decided to settle it himself, which was, after all, the only thing any of them had ever really taught him to do. "How does it get hunted?" Harry said. Every head turned. It was the first thing he'd said since, the network. Harry's voice came out steadier than he felt, the level voice, the most afraid voice, and he saw his father hear it and saw the flicker of pain it cost him. "You've been hunting these things for years and you've got nothing because you don't have an instrument. You said it yourself." He met Dumbledore's eyes and made himself hold them. "I've got an instrument. I've had it for 4 days. I can feel them. Right now. East across the water, there's a diary. And there's something that pulls harder than the rest, older, a ring maybe. And there's more I can't sort out yet, scattered, all of them humming at the exact pitch of the thing in my head, because they are the thing in my head. We're the same splinter cut a different number of times." The pull throbbed behind his sternum as he named it, as though pleased to be acknowledged, and he saw Abe go tense in his tank, and he made himself keep going. "There's no one else in either of your worlds who can walk into a room and tell you which jar the death is hidden in. There's only me, because I'm one of the jars." "Harry," said Liz very quietly from the wall. "You want them destroyed," Harry said to Dumbledore. "He," a tip of his head at his father, "wants me to live. The only way anybody gets what they want is if the thing in me goes hunting the rest of itself with me steering." He laid both hands flat on the table to stop them shaking. "So send me into your world after the network. Let me find them, everyone, and unmake them, everyone, and we'll leave the last jar for last. We'll leave me for last. And by the time we get there, maybe Grandpa's found his door, or maybe he hasn't. But either way, it'll be the vessel that decides what happens to the vessel, and not a table full of people who love it." He looked finally at his father, and his voice nearly went, and he held it, because he was Hellboy's son, and you held it. "That's the deal. That's the only deal I'll take. I go in, I do the job, and when we get to the end of the trail, whatever's standing there, it's mine to walk up to. Nobody spends me, not for a war, not even to save me. Mine." There was a long silence. Hellboy looked at his son for what felt to Harry like a very long time. And then the corner of his mouth moved, just slightly, in something that was not quite a smile but was the thing Hellboy did instead of being proud, because being proud out loud wasn't in him. "Yeah," Hellboy said, rough. "Okay, that's my kid." He turned to Dumbledore, and the danger was still in him, banked but not gone, and he said, "He goes in as ours. Bureau credentials, bureau backup, bureau rules. He's not a student, he's not a soldier, and he is sure as hell not a sacrifice you've got tucked in your back pocket for a rainy day. He's a field agent working a cachet network, and the last jar on the list is off the table till he says different. And if I find out you've been gentling him toward a grave behind my back," the stone hand flexed, "you'll learn what the rest of those 19 cases learned about what walks out of this mountain when something it loves gets touched. We clear?" Dumbledore looked at the demon, and at the boy, and at the file that was older than his ministry, and something in the ancient face changed. Not surrender, Harry thought, but the careful, grieving recalculation of a man who had walked in certain of one terrible thing and was leaving uncertain of it, which for Dumbledore was its own kind of earthquake. "We are clear," Dumbledore said quietly. And I find, to my very great surprise, and not entirely to my comfort, that I am glad to be." He rose and gathered his winter-blue robes, and for just a moment the kindness in his old eyes was unguarded and simple. "You were raised well, Harry, better, perhaps, than I would have managed. I shall spend whatever time I have left hoping that the file is right and the storybooks are wrong." He inclined his head. "Hogwarts will receive you within the month. Do try not to terrify the children. Most of them have never met a real field agent, and none of them have met your father." They left the way they came, and Harry sat at the long table between his two worlds with the pull throbbing east behind his sternum. And he understood, with the cold clarity that was the truest thing in him, that he had just volunteered to spend the next stretch of his life hunting down and destroying the scattered pieces of a Dark Lord's soul, and that the trail he was about to follow ran in a long curve across an entire country and through a castle full of strangers and ended, every map agreed, at a mirror. He picked up the knitted stag and turned it over in his hands and held his nail in the other, cold iron warming to his grip, and behind his scar the splinter stirred, pleased, patient, finally going home, and whispered something in a language no one had taught him. And Harry put his free hand over his true heart and felt for the difference, and did not answer. Hogwarts was the most haunted building Harry had ever walked into, and nobody who lived there had the faintest idea. He noticed it before he was through the front doors, before the carriages, even while the castle was still just a silhouette of impossible towers against a bruised evening sky, and every other new arrival around him was gasping at how beautiful it was. It was beautiful. Harry granted that, the way you grant that a tiger is beautiful, while also noting which way it's facing. But underneath, the beauty his trained senses were filling in a second map nobody else seemed to be reading. The cold spots strung along the corridors like beads, the residue of old violence soaked into particular stones, the dozen-plus discreet ghosts drifting the halls as casually as cats, the deep wards humming in the foundations like a held chord, and, this was the part that made the back of his neck prickle, a thin, persistent wrongness that had nothing to do with any of it, a single sour note, eastward and below, that his sternum had been pulling toward since the train crossed the Scottish border. One of the pieces was here. In the castle. He'd suspected it from the resonance map the Bureau had built. Standing on the threshold, he was certain. "Magnificent, isn't it?" said the witch escorting him, Professor McGonagall, deputy headmistress, a tall, severe woman in tartan who had met him at the gates with the expression of someone who had been told to expect a great deal and was reserving judgment. "Most students never forget their first sight of it." "It's leaking," Harry said. McGonagall's eyebrows rose. "I beg your pardon, third floor northwest corner and the dungeons under the lake. You've got 2 breaches in the ward lattice where something's been worrying at it from outside, slow for years. Probably nothing, could be everything." He was already crouching, running 2 fingers along the doorstep, where a line of something dark and crystalline had been worked into the stone generations ago. "Huh! Somebody salted the threshold. Good! Whoever did that knew their business." He straightened and dusted his hands and found McGonagall staring at him as though he'd begun speaking in tongues, which, given the contents of his head, was a possibility he tried not to dwell on. "Sorry, force of habit. You said magnificent, I agree. It's a magnificent, badly secured, structurally haunted castle full of children, and I've been sent here to find a piece of a dead man's soul hidden somewhere inside it before it wakes up all the way. So I read the room. It's nothing personal against the room." "I see," said McGonagall in the voice of a woman recalibrating. "The headmaster did warn me you would be unusual." "He's being polite," Harry said. "Where do I put my gear?" The sorting nearly went wrong, and it was the first thing all evening that he hadn't been able to read 3 seconds ahead. Dumbledore had decided for cover for the comfort of the other students. For 100 small political reasons Harry only half followed that Harry would be enrolled as a 6th-year transfer. And that meant, to Harry's mild disbelief, sitting on a stool in front of the entire school while a frayed and ancient hat decided which dormitory he'd be filed under. He'd argued it was operationally absurd. Dumbledore had observed, with infuriating gentleness, that a field agent who could not tolerate a hat would not last a week against the things that wore the wizarding world's nightmares, and Harry had conceded the point mostly to stop the old man enjoying himself. So he sat. And the hall went quiet, hundreds of faces turned up at the boy whose name they all knew from stories. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, vanished 16 years, come back at last, and McGonagall lowered the patched old hat onto his head, and a voice spoke directly into his mind. Dry and conversational. Well now, let's see what we ha. The voice stopped. Harry felt it stop the way you feel a person flinch back from a stove. The hat had reached into him, the way Abe reached into things, the way the sorting reached into every child, and it had touched the cold passenger behind his scar and recoiled. For one long, silent, public second, the oldest reading instrument in the wizarding world sat on the head of a 16-year-old field agent and did not know what to say. And Harry could feel the whole hall waiting, and he could feel the splinter behind his eyes uncoil with interest at being noticed. Reaching for the wheel, lighting up the wire, and Harry did the thing he had been raised since the cradle to do. He put one hand flat against his own chest, over the true heartbeat, and he thought, very calmly and very clearly in the voice that was unmistakably his own. Don't talk to the passenger. Talk to me. I'm the driver. There's a thing riding in the back. Ignore it. It doesn't get a vote. Now sort the boy and let's get on with it. There was a pause. Then the hat said, into his mind alone, with something that in a hat passed for profound respect. In nearly 1,000 years, child, I have never been given instructions. You have a horror in you old enough and clever enough to frighten me, and you spoke past it like a man stepping around a sleeping dog. There is only one house for someone who can do that and not be eaten. And then, aloud to the whole, in a voice gone oddly thoughtful, Gryffindor. And under its breath, to Harry only. Mind the passenger, boy. It was listening to every word. Harry took off the hat and handed it back to McGonagall and walked to the cheering red and gold table with the cold a little sharper under his ribs than it had been an hour ago, and understood that he had just learned in front of the whole school exactly how much it cost to use his head as a public address system. Noted, he thought, quieter next time. He found out how the rest of the room would handle him about 10 minutes later, when a friendly round-faced boy down the bench asked him, in the hushed, thrilled tone everyone used, whether it was true he'd been hidden away all these years to keep him safe from you-know-who. And Harry, reaching for the potatoes, said, from Voldemort? Yeah, sort of. The effect was remarkable. It went down the table like a cold wind, flinches, indrawn breaths, a dropped goblet, 2 younger students actually ducking. Conversation for 10 feet in every direction simply stopped. Harry looked up from the potatoes at a sea of stricken faces and felt the particular weary patience of a man realizing he is going to have this conversation a great many times. It's a name, he said to the table at large, not unkindly. Tom Riddle. That's the name under the name, did you know that? Half-blood, mother's side magical, father a muggle who left. Picked himself a scary title at school because Tom doesn't keep people up at night. He took some potatoes. Where I was raised, we say things names out loud, on purpose. Because a name's a handle, and a handle's a leash, and the day you're too scared to say a thing's name is the day it's already winning and you just haven't noticed. You can keep flinching if you want. I'd rather you didn't. It's going to make the next part of my job a lot harder if everyone in this castle treats the most useful tool I've got like a swear word. Nobody answered, but the round-faced boy was looking at him with something other than fear now. And 3 seats down, a bushy-haired girl who had been pointedly reading a book all through dinner had lowered it a careful inch and was looking at Harry over the top of it with an expression he recognized. Because it was the expression he wore himself when something in a room turned out to be more interesting than he'd been led to expect. Her name was Hermione Granger, and she found him at 2 o'clock the following morning, salting a corridor. He'd expected to be alone. The castle slept. The case did not. He'd been working the leak in the third-floor northwest corner. The breach he'd clocked on arrival, laying down a line of consecrated iron filings and salt across the threshold of a disused classroom while he traced the sour note, the pull, trying to triangulate it without reaching out hard enough to light the wire. It was painstaking, undramatic work, the actual texture of the trade, and he was 3 feet of salt line in when a voice behind him said, crisp and entirely unfrightened, "That's not on the curriculum." He didn't startle. He'd heard her 2 corridors back. She walked like someone who'd never had to be quiet, but he was impressed in spite of himself that she'd found him at all. He looked up. The bushy-haired girl from dinner stood in the dark in a dressing gown with her arms folded and her chin up, and a wand held loosely but readily at her side. And she was studying his salt line with an intensity that was, frankly, refreshing after a day of people studying his scar. "It's not on yours," Harry agreed and went back to pouring. "I'm not really a student. You worked that out already, though, or you wouldn't be standing where you can see both exits." A flicker of something, surprise, then a sharpening, crossed her face. "Most people don't notice when I do that. Most people aren't paying attention. You are. It's the only interesting thing that's happened to me since I got here." He finished the line, sat back on his heels, and looked at her properly. "Go on, then. You've been working up to a question since dinner. You don't strike me as the type to lose sleep over the boy who lived. So it's not me, it's the method. You watched me put a name to a thing the whole hall was afraid of, and you watched me walk out of dinner like I had somewhere to be. And now you've followed me to a locked corridor at 2 in the morning to watch me pour salt on a floor, and you want to know what kind of magic this is. Because it isn't any kind you've read about, and you've read about all of them." He raised an eyebrow. "How am I doing?" Hermione Granger stared at him for a moment. Then, to his considerable surprise, she crossed the corridor, sat down on the cold stone across the salt line from him, tucked her dressing gown around her knees, and said, with the focused hunger of someone who had spent her whole life being the cleverest person in every room and was tired of it, "It isn't magic at all, is it? Not the way we do it. There's no wand. There's no incantation. You're not casting anything." She nodded at the salt, the iron, the chalk he'd been about to lay. "You're doing engineering on the supernatural. You've got rules, materials. A whole discipline nobody here has even heard of, and you treat our entire world like it's one specialized chapter of a much bigger book." Her eyes were bright. "I've spent 6 years being told there's nothing left to learn that isn't in the restricted section. And you walked in this morning and read this castle like it was leaking, and you were right, weren't you? I checked. There is a ward fault in the northwest corner. It's in Hogwarts. A history as an unexplained structural anomaly, and everyone just—" She made a frustrated gesture. "Accepts it? You don't accept anything. You figure it out." She took a breath. "Teach me." And Harry, who had been raised by people who taught the way they loved, gruffly and completely, and who had not, in 16 years, met a single person his own age who looked at the strange, dangerous trade of his life and said, "Teach me," instead of "Get away from me," felt something in his chest that was warm and had nothing to do with the cold passenger at all. "I don't take students," he said. And then, because she'd already started arguing, and because he was going to need someone who knew this castle's bones and its books and its blind spots, someone with the inside knowledge his outside paradigm couldn't supply. "But I could use a partner who knows where the library keeps the things nobody's supposed to read. I work the case, you work the world. You bring me what your side knows, I'll teach you to see what mine sees. Deal, deal," said Hermione Granger, and stuck her hand across the salt line to shake on it, and then, because she was who she was, immediately added, "What case?" So he told her. Most of it. He told her about the network, and the cachet file, and the man who'd hidden his death in a scatter of vessels, and the one that was somewhere in this castle pulling at the thing behind his eyes. He did not, yet, tell her about the last jar. There were some things you didn't say at 2 in the morning to someone you'd known for a day, even if the someone was looking at you like you'd handed her the keys to the universe. Some things you left for last. It took them 4 nights to find the door, and the door, when they found it, undid even Harry a little. He'd been narrowing the pull all week, and on the 4th night he made a decision he knew Liz would have smacked him for. He stopped triangulating the careful, slow, safe way, and he reached out. He stood in the 7th floor corridor, and he let the wire light up, and he sang back to the buried thing, "Here, where are you, here?" And the passenger surged into the open like a held breath let go. And for one vertiginous second, Harry saw the whole castle the way it saw it. Every soul a smear of warm meat, every ward a cage, every shadow a place to hide a knife. And then he had the location, an exact point in the blank stretch of wall opposite a tapestry of a man trying to teach trolls to dance. And he snapped the wire shut and came back to himself on his knees on the cold floor with his breath pouring white into the corridor and frost climbing the stones around his hands, and Hermione's voice, very far away and very frightened, saying his name. "I'm fine," he managed. He wasn't. The cold was bad this time, worse than the sorting. A tear-deep draw that had left the passenger's voice ringing in his skull like a struck bell. Closer, closer, almost home. And when he looked up, Hermione had stepped back from him just half a pace. Just the involuntary flinch he'd been getting his whole life, and the look on her face was the look the junior tech had worn at 10 years old, and Harry felt the old shame rise and put one hand flat over his true heart and breathed through it. "I'm fine. That's the cost. That's what it costs to use the thing in my head as a compass. The more I reach for it, the louder it gets, and the louder it gets, the more it bleeds out as," he gestured at the frost, I shouldn't have done it that hard. I was showing off." He climbed to his feet, unsteady. "I'm sorry. I scared you. It scares me too. That's the right reaction. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't." To her enormous credit, Hermione closed the half-pace she'd opened. "What is it?" she said low. "The thing in your head. You said a fragment of his soul is in the castle. You never said—" She looked at his scar, and Harry watched her arrive at it the way he'd watched Dumbledore arrive at it, the way they all did, the slow, horrible click. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, Harry, there's one in you. That's how you can feel them." "Your last jar on the list," Harry said. "Yeah. Now you know the thing I wasn't going to tell you at 2 in the morning." He met her eyes and made himself say the rest, because she'd earned it and because he'd need her clear-eyed for what came next. "Which is why I need a partner who'll watch me, Hermione, really watch me. Because there's going to come a day on this case when I reach for that compass one time too many, and the passenger gets loud enough to feel like me, and on that day I'm going to need somebody standing close enough to tell me which voice is which. Can you do that? Can you stand close to the thing that scares you and keep your eyes open?" She didn't answer right away. She looked at the frost, and the scar, and the boy. And then she set her jaw in a way Harry would come to know very well, and she said, "I read Hogwarts, a history 11 times because nobody else would tell me how the magic worked. I'm not afraid of the thing that scares me. I'm afraid of not understanding it. Show me the door." The door was the room of requirement, and it appeared when Harry walked past the blank wall 3 times thinking, grimly, "I need to find the place where the dead man hid his death." And a great iron-banded door faded into being, and they pushed it open onto a room the size of a cathedral, stacked to its vanishing ceiling with the accumulated hidden junk of 1,000 years. Furniture and books and broken instruments and forgotten contraband, canyons and mountains of it, a whole lost civilization of things people had needed not to be found. And somewhere in it, pulling at Harry's sternum like a hook through the breastbone, was the diadem. They found it on a bust of a leering stone warlock, half an hour deep into the labyrinth. A tarnished silver circlet set with a dull blue stone, beautiful once, filthy now, and radiating a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the thing it had been made to hold. Harry stopped 6 feet from it and did not go closer, because the moment he saw it, his own passenger had lunged, the loudest it had ever been. A flood of cold up his spine and a voice in his skull that was no longer whispering, that was crowing. 2 pieces of one severed soul recognizing each other across a canyon of junk and straining to close the gap. "Don't touch it," Harry said, and his voice came out strange, doubled, and he heard it and clamped his hand over his heart and dragged the words back into his own register by main force. Don't anybody touch it. When I get close, it's going to be bad. The two pieces want to be one piece. The closer I get, the harder mine pulls toward it, and if I lose the wheel even for a second with that thing in reach. He didn't finish. He didn't have to. I need you to do exactly what I say when I say it, and if I tell you to run, you run and you don't look back and you don't try to save me, because the thing wearing my face won't be worth saving. Understood? Understood, Hermione said, white but steady, wand up. Then Harry went to work, and for the first time Hermione Granger watched a Bureau field agent unmake a piece of a Dark Lord's soul, and understood that everything her world called the darkest magic there is was, to the people who'd raised this boy, a procedure. He did not smash it. That was the thing she'd remember. Every instinct in the wizarding world screamed destroy the object, and Harry did the opposite. He drew a circle. Chalk first, then salt, then a ring of iron filings, the diadem at its center, his hands shaking with the cold but his lines unbroken, because don't break the circle till you know its name, and the circle wasn't to keep it in. The circle was to keep it honest, to stop the fragment fleeing the vessel the instant the vessel broke. Then he knelt at the edge of the ring, and he did the thing the whole castle was too afraid to do. He named it. I know what you are. Harry said to the diadem, in a voice that was his own, that he held to his own by sheer trained will, while the passenger howled to be let loose. You're a piece of Tom Riddle, cut off and hidden in a pretty thing so the rest of him couldn't die. I'm naming you, and you're bound, and you have to answer, and the answer is no. No more hiding, no going home. He drew a single nail of cold black iron from his coat, not his nail, never that, but its brother, one of a dozen the Bureau had forged him, and he set its point against the dull blue stone. Tom Riddle, this piece of you is unmade, and he drove the cold iron through the heart of the vessel. The diadem screamed. A column of black, oily knotlight erupted out of it, the trapped fragment tearing loose with nowhere to flee, because the named circle held it honest, thrashing against the binding, and the worst of it was not the scream. The worst of it was that Harry's own scar screamed with it. The passenger keening in sympathy and rage as it watched a piece of itself die. And for one endless second, Harry felt the cold take the wheel, felt himself slide into the back of his own skull while something old and patient reached for the controls, and Hermione's voice cut through it, sharp and clear and absolutely terrified, shouting the one thing he'd taught her to shout. Harry, which voice is yours? And Harry, falling, put his hand over his true heart and felt for the difference and found it small, quiet, his own, and climbed back up the inside of his own head hand over hand and slammed the wheel back into his own grip, just as the black knot-light guttered and shrank and, with a final thin wail, went out. The diadem lay in the broken circle, a dead and tarnished circlet, ordinary now. The cold drained out of the room. Harry knelt over it, shaking, soaked in sweat that was freezing on his skin. And Hermione was suddenly there beside him, not flinching, holding his shoulder, having crossed the line he'd told her never to cross. And she was saying his name, just his name, over and over. And it was the most important word in the world because it was his and he held on to it. One, he said when he could speak. He was grinning, a little, the manic grin of a man who has just survived something. We got one, Hermione. That's the first one anyone in either of your worlds has ever taken down clean. Bind it, name it, kill the jar while it's honest. That's the method. That's the whole method. Write it down. He laughed raw. We're going to take them all down just like that, every one. And then his grin faded, because in the silence after the diadem died, the pull behind his sternum had not gone quiet. It had gotten louder. He went still, the way Abe went still, the way the hat had gone still on his head. He reached out, careful this time, just a feather touch, just enough, and he felt the network feel its own wound, felt the other vessels pulse harder in alarm at the death of one of their own, calling out across the dark country, "One of us is gone. Where are you? Are you there?" and Harry, kneeling in the wreckage of his first kill with his partner's hand on his shoulder, counted them as they answered. 1, far south, paper thin and venomous, a book. 2, east and old, a small heavy weight, a ring. 3, gold and gleaming and hungry, a cup behind doors he couldn't see. And a 5th that did not answer from anywhere out in the dark country at all, that answered from 6 inches behind his own eyes, warm and patient, and now, after watching exactly how its brothers were going to die, very, very awake. 3 more out there, Harry said quietly into the cold. And one that isn't out there. He put his hand over his true heart and felt for the difference and held on. One that's going to be watching me come the whole way. Harry sat with the dead diadem in his lap for a long time after Hermione had gone to bed, turning it over, doing the arithmetic he had been avoiding since the moment it screamed. The method worked. That was the thing he could not stop looking at, the way you can't stop pressing a bruise. Bind it, name it, kill the jar while it's honest. He had proved it. The first clean unmaking of a cachet vessel in 104 years, done by a 16-year-old on a stone floor with chalk and salt and a nail. He should have felt nothing but the cold professional satisfaction his father felt after a job. Instead, he sat in the dark and felt the arithmetic close around him like a circle drawn in his own hand. Because the method had a step he had skipped past in the heat of it, a step that only mattered when the vessel was not a circlet of tarnished silver, but a person. Kill the jar. The fragment could not flee a bound and named circle. It died when the vessel died. And there was no version of the method, none, in which the vessel survived. He had searched the whole 104-year file in his memory, and Bruttenholm had said it plainly at the long table in the mountain. In every documented case, the vessel was an object, or a creature already lost. You unmade the death by breaking the thing that held it. He was a thing that held it. He had spent the evening teaching Hermione, with real pride, exactly how to kill what he was. Harry set the diadem down on the floor and put his hand flat over his true heart and breathed. The way Abe had taught him, the way he'd been doing his whole life. And for the first time in his whole life, it did not entirely help, because the thing he was afraid of was not the passenger. The passenger he knew how to fight. The thing he was afraid of was the file, cold, correct, written by people who loved him, sitting in a cabinet under a mountain with his own classification freshly entered in it, and every word of it true. The call came the next morning, and it was worse than the night had been, because the night had only been his own fear, and the morning was his family agreeing with it. They patched him through to the mountain on the Bureau's secure line, Bruttenholm in the archive, Hellboy a red shape behind him, Abe a blue smear at the edge of the frame, and Harry knew before anyone spoke, from the particular silence on his grandfather's face. The don't lie to the boy silence he'd known since he was 7. He'd seen that silence deliver the truth about the splinter in his head. He recognized the shape of it now larger. You found something, Harry said, and it's bad. The directors have reviewed the diadem operation, Bruttenholm said. He said it carefully, each word set down like a stone across a river he did not want to cross. The method is confirmed, which means, Harry, you must understand the position they are in, which means that for the first time in the Bureau's history, we possess a reliable procedure for unmaking a cachet vessel. And we have, on our own roster, a confirmed and active vessel, one that can be possessed. One that the enemy could, in principle, turn into a weapon against us, or repossess entirely the moment your discipline fails. The old man's hands were folded on the desk, and his knuckles were white. Protocol is not ambiguous on this point, my boy. A confirmed cachet vessel is a containment priority. They have classified you. They are recommending neutralization. The word sat in the cold morning air of the empty classroom. Harry was proud later that he did not flinch from it, because he was Hellboy's son and you didn't flinch, and because some buried part of him had been waiting for this exact sentence his whole life and was almost relieved to finally hear it spoken. Neutralization, he repeated. That's the file's word. I've read the file. Vessels are not casualties, they are containment failures, and the responsible action is closure." He looked at his grandfather, at the white knuckles, and understood, and the understanding was the worst thing of all. "You wrote that line, didn't you?" "That exact line. I learned it as a kid. You wrote the file that says I have to die." Bruttenholm's face did something Harry had never seen it do in 16 years. It came apart. "I wrote it 40 years ago," the old man whispered, "about things, about cursed relics and dead men's bones and horrors that had already devoured their hosts. I wrote it to give my agents a clean rule for an unclean world, so that no one would hesitate over a thing that needed ending. I never—" His voice cracked, an old scholar's voice, dry from a lifetime of being certain, breaking now over the one thing his certainty had never accounted for. "I never imagined I was writing the death warrant of my own grandson. I have spent every hour since that long table trying to find the flaw in my own gospel. The exception, the other ending. Because the file is right, Harry, that is the unbearable part. The file is correct and careful, and I cannot fault a word of it. And it is pointed at the only thing in this world I love more than being correct." And then Hellboy moved into the frame and put one great red hand on the old man's shoulder and looked into the camera at his son. And his voice was very quiet and very level, the dangerous level, and he said the thing that made the whole morning bearable. "Here's what's gonna happen," Hellboy said. "Nothing. Nothing is gonna happen to you, kid, because I told the directors exactly where they could file their recommendation, and I used some words your grandfather won't let me repeat on the secure line. You want to know the difference between the file and me? The file was written by smart, careful, correct people who never had to love one of the things they were classifying. That's not a knock on him. That's just the limit of him. The file can tell you what a vessel is. It can't tell you what a vessel's worth, because worth isn't a property of the thing, it's a property of who's standing next to it." He tapped the screen once hard. "And I'm standing next to you. So is your grandfather, even if it's killing him. So is the fish and the fire starter and a frizzy-haired kid in a castle who crossed a line you told her never to cross. The file's got one classification for you. You've got 6 people who've got a different one. And in my long, ugly, correct experience, kid, the 6 people win. Every time it matters, they win." Harry's throat was tight. "Dumbledore says I have to die too," he said low. "The prophecy, neither can live. He's been planning my funeral for 16 years, gentle as you like, and now the Bureau says it. The 2 of them have spent my whole life hating everything about each other, and the one thing they agree on, the one thing, is that the responsible, correct, grown-up thing to do is end me. Doesn't that—" His voice nearly went, he held it, he was Hellboy's son. "Doesn't it scare you that they agree? When your enemy and your home agree on something, doesn't that usually mean they're right?" "No," said Hellboy. "It means they're both standing too far away to see you. Correct and cruel hold hands across a long enough distance, kid. That's the whole reason I file my horns up close every morning where I can see 'em. You don't let the people standing far away decide who you are. You let the people standing close." He held Harry's eyes through the screen. "Your grandfather's gonna find the other ending. You're gonna keep hunting the network. And when we get to the end of the trail, when it's down to the last jar, it's your call to walk up to, like you said in the mountain. Nobody's spending you. Not Dumbledore's war, not the Bureau's file. Not even me, much as I'd burn down both your worlds to keep you breathing. You hear me? Your call." "I hear you," Harry said, and he did. He held on to it for the rest of that day, the warmth of 6 people winning, the way he held the nail in his fist. It was the truest thing anyone said to him in the whole long, terrible business, and he would need it desperately before the day was out, because the passenger had heard every word too, had heard they want to kill us, even the ones who love us, even home. And the passenger had been waiting his whole life for the hour when Harry was frightened enough, and alone enough and cornered enough to want the help it had always been offering. That hour came at dusk. The thing came through the 3rd-floor breach, and Harry knew it for what it was the instant he smelled it, which was the only reason any of them lived. He'd been doing his rounds, Hermione beside him, 2 younger students trailing along because the round-faced boy, Edmund, second year, who had stopped being afraid of Harry somewhere around the third time Harry explained the salt without condescending, had attached himself with the devotion of a kid who'd found someone that treated his questions like they mattered. They were at the northwest corner, the leaking corner, when the temperature dropped, and the salt line Harry had laid a week ago hissed and smoked, and something put one long grey limb through the ward fault Harry had flagged on his very first morning and pulled itself, joint by wrong joint, into the castle. It was the diadem's death that had rung the bell. Harry understood that in a glance. The thing was a scavenger, a Colden's hound the file called it, a folkloric carrion eater that fed on dying magic and souls coming loose. And the unmaking of a cachet vessel, a week past, had rung across the old hidden world like a struck bell, and called every grave thing within 100 miles to the smell of soul. The wizarding world had no name for it and no defense against it. Their wards were built to keep out wizards, and this was older than wizards. It came on like a spider made of famine, and it went straight for the youngest, brightest soul in the corridor, which was Edmund. Harry did everything right. He got between the thing and the boy. He had cold iron and salt and silver, and every trick the trade had taught him, and he used them, fast and clean and exactly as drilled, and it was not enough, and the awful clarity of that was the whole tragedy of being what he was. He was a mortal boy with thin arms and a bag of folkloric countermeasures. And the Colden's hound was 300 years of hunger that shrugged off his silver and snapped his iron and knocked him into the wall hard enough to gray his vision, and reached past his crumpling body for the screaming child, and his wild cold came up the way it always did, faithful to no one, a useless gout of frost that the thing walked through like a curtain. And Harry, on his knees, blood in his mouth, watched the grey limb close on Edmund's throat and knew, with the cold flat certainty of a field agent reading a room, that he had lost, that the boy was about to die, that there was nothing left in his own mortal arsenal that could stop it. And the passenger said, gently into the ringing silence of his skull, "I can." It was not a hiss. That was the horror of it. After 16 years of cold whispers in a dead man's tongue, the passenger spoke now in a voice that was reasonable and warm and almost exactly his own, the voice of a friend leaning close in a crisis. "You can't save him, Harry. Look at you. You're mortal. You were always going to be the weak link. They were right about that in the mountain. But I'm not mortal, and I'm not weak, and I am right here, and all you have to do is stop holding the wheel so tightly. Just for a second. Just long enough to save the boy. Surely the boy is worth 1 second. Surely you're allowed this once to use the thing you carry for good. Let me drive." And Edmund made a small choking sound. And Harry, who had been raised since the cradle to refuse exactly this, who could hear his father saying some mornings it'd be easier, the crowned feel good, that's the whole trick of it, looked at the dying child, and made the only choice a decent person could make, and the worst choice he had ever made, which were, devastatingly, the same choice. He let go of the wheel. The cold that came out of him then was nothing like the wild, useless frost. It was directed. It was patient. It was a craftsman's cold, and it took the Colden's hound apart with an ease that was obscene, froze the marrow in its ancient bones, and named it in the old grave tongue, and unmade it where it stood, casual as a man stepping on an insect. And the grey thing that had eaten souls for 300 years came apart with a thin, despairing wail and was gone. And Edmund dropped to the floor, alive, gasping, saved, and it felt good. That was the part Harry had not been warned about, the part no one could have warned him about. The relief of it. The power, after a lifetime of being the weak link, of being for 1 second enough. The clean, cold competence of doing a thing perfectly that his mortal hands could never have done. For 1 second that would haunt him. Harry Potter stood in a frozen corridor over a child he had saved and felt the crown settle onto his head and felt how good it was, how easy, how right, and a small, cool voice that was almost his own said, "See, was that so bad? We make a good team, you and I," and he almost agreed. Then Hermione's voice, raw with terror, from somewhere behind him. "Harry, which voice is yours?" And Harry came back to himself the way you come up from deep water, lungs burning, and slammed his hand over his true heart and felt for the difference. And it was harder to find now. That was the cost. The voices had blurred. The passenger had spent 1 second wearing his face and his preferences and his love for the boy. And the line between them was no longer a wall but a smudge. And he clawed his own quiet heartbeat out from under the warm, reasonable cold and dragged the wheel back into his own 2 hands, shaking. And the crown lifted off, and he was Harry again, mortal and breakable and himself. But it had cost him. He felt the cost arrive even as he stood there panting, 3 separate small thefts, and each one landed. The scar spread. He felt it, a hairline crack of cold splitting off from the old lightning bolt, traveling an inch down his temple, a new branch on a dead tree. His temperament shifted. He looked at the spot where the Colden's hound had died and felt, instead of the horror he should have felt, a flat clinical satisfaction, a riddle-cool contempt for a week-old thing that had got what it deserved. And he caught the feeling and recognized it as not his and was sickened. And the sickness was the only thing that was reliably him anymore. And a memory grayed. He reached for it later that night, the way you check a pocket, a small one, a good one, his father at the bottom of the mountain reading him a list of true names off the side of a coffee mug, because they'd run out of books. Hellboy's gravel voice making the old grave tongue sound like a grocery list. Harry laughing, and it was gone, not forgotten but erased. A clean gray absence where a warm thing used to be, taken in payment, and he would never get it back. And he did not even have the mercy of remembering exactly what he'd lost. Just the shape of the hole. That was tier 2. That was the cliff, 1 step down. And the worst of it, the thing he could not say even to Hermione, was that part of him, a small, cold, growing part, thought the trade had been worth it. Hermione found him an hour later in the disused classroom, sitting on the floor with the dead diadem and the nail and his hand pressed flat over his heart, and she did not flinch, and she did not ask if he was all right, because she was cleverer than that. She sat down across from him, in the same spot she'd taken the first night, and she said, "You saved Edmund's life." "I let it drive," Harry said. "I let the thing in my head take the wheel. The exact thing my whole family's spent 16 years teaching me never to do, I did it, because a kid was dying and it was the only thing that would work." He looked at her, and his eyes were wet and furious and afraid. "And it worked, Hermione, that's the trap. That's the whole trap, and I walked right into it knowing it was a trap. It told me I was allowed just this once for something good. And I was. Edmund's alive, and it cost me a piece of myself I can't get back, and the worst part, the part I can't." His voice broke at last, the held thing finally giving. "The worst part is some of me thinks I'd do it again. For a good enough reason. And next time the reason'll be a little smaller, and the time after that, that's how the horns grow, not all at once. One good reason at a time." Hermione was quiet. Then she reached across the space between them, slowly, telegraphing it, and put her hand over the back of his, the one pressed to his chest, and held it there over his true heart, and she said, fierce and certain in the way she got certain, "Then we find the other way faster. Before the reasons get smaller." She squeezed his hand. "Your grandfather's looking for it. You're not doing this alone, Harry. You've got 6 people, you said. I'm 7. We get to the end of the trail, and there's another ending, and you don't have to be brave and walk up to a mirror, because someone who loves you found a door in the wall first." She looked at him. "That's the whole job now. The Horcruxes are the easy part. The hard part is keeping you, the quiet part, the part that just cried, the part that doesn't make any noise, keeping that part holding the wheel until we find the door. Can you do that?" "I don't know," Harry said honestly. "Good," said Hermione. "People who say they know are the ones who lose it. Come on. You need sleep, and I need to write down everything that just happened in the precise order it happened, because I think using a soul fragment costs the user graded increments of self is the single most important thing anyone in either of our worlds has ever discovered, and nobody but us knows it." She hauled him up. We're going to beat this. We're going to find the door. I've never lost at anything in my life, and I'm not starting with you." Harry let her pull him up and held his nail and almost believed her. Two things happened that night, in two different parts of the world, and Harry knew of neither until it was too late. The first was a message, waiting on the bureau line when he finally dragged himself back to his quarters. His grandfather's face, recorded, alight with the particular fierce joy Harry had only ever seen on him over a research breakthrough. "Harry, I've found it, or rather I've found the thread that leads to it. The file is wrong about the ending, my boy, just as Hellboy said. I went back past the file, past the modern cases, to the oldest tellings of Kashay himself, and the oldest tellings do not end with the host destroyed. They end with the death returned, taken out of the needle and put back into the man, so that the man becomes mortal again and the vessel is simply emptied. Set down. Alive. There is a method older than my file, Harry, and it does not require you to die. But the knowing of it was never written down, it was kept in the old country by the sort of source one does not telephone. I'm going myself, tonight, quietly before the directors can forbid it. Don't worry the others. I'll come home with your door in the wall, I promise you. I'll come home." Harry watched it 3 times and wept and slept for the first time in days with something like hope, and did not hear, under his grandfather's joy, the thing the audience to his life would have heard at once. The words "I'm going myself," and "the old country," and the sort of source one does not telephone, and "I'll come home," did not hear because he loved the old man and wanted to believe him, the unmistakable sound of a flag going up over a thing that was not going to come home. The second thing happened far to the south, in a cold ruin where a half-made thing was knitting itself back into the world, and it did not have a witness, and it needed none. Lord Voldemort had felt the diadem die. He had felt it the way a man feels a tooth come out, a wrongness, a sudden absence where a part of himself had been, a draught through a door that should have been sealed forever. He had told himself it was nothing, a flaw in the hiding, an accident of time. He had built his immortality with such care, scattered his death so cleverly that the notion of someone hunting the pieces was not merely unlikely, it was, to his understanding of his own genius, impossible. No one knew the method. No one in all the world knew how the vessels were made, let alone how they might be unmade. He had made certain of it, and then he had felt the second thing, the thing that turned his cold attention like a key in a lock. And he went very still in the dark of his ruin and listened down the length of the wire that bound all his scattered pieces into one undying whole, and he heard, faintly, impossibly, one of his own anchors thinking, not waiting, not hiding, hunting. He felt it reach out along the wire, a vessel reaching for its brothers. Here, where are you? Here, felt it counting them, felt it learning them, felt it turning the network's own resonance into a map of his death. And Lord Voldemort, who had not been afraid of anything in 50 years, felt the cold finger of something very like fear trace the length of his half-made spine. One of his Horcruxes had a mind of its own. And then, because he was clever, the cleverest thing his world had ever produced, clever enough to hide his death in 7 vessels and clever enough now to follow the wire back to its source. He understood which one, and the understanding was so beautiful and so terrible that the ruin around him seemed to lean in to hear it. The boy. The last vessel. The one he had made by accident in a nursery 16 years ago and lost. The one his servants swore had been spirited away by the dead mother's magic. Gone, untraceable, irrelevant. Not gone. Not irrelevant. Raised. Raised by someone who had taught it to hunt, taught it to think, taught it to turn the thing inside it into a weapon and point that weapon at the very immortality it was supposed to guarantee. The accident in the nursery had become the one blade in all the world shaped exactly to fit his throat. "Harry Potter," said Lord Voldemort into the dark, tasting it, and somewhere a country away a boy asleep with a knitted stag in his arms shivered in his dreams. "You have been busy." And he turned, all of him, every scattered, cold, patient piece of him, toward the north and the castle and the boy and began at last to plan. Hope, Harry learned that week, was the cruelest thing his grandfather had ever given him. He kept the message. He watched it more times than was good for him, the old man's face alight with the joy of a breakthrough. "I'll come home with your door in the wall, I promise you." And for 3 days he let himself believe it, because believing it was warm and the alternative was a cold he already knew too well. He told Hermione about the other way, the real one, the one older than the phial. Return the death to the man, empty the vessel, the host survives. He let himself imagine a future in which he reached the end of the trail, and there was no mirror waiting, only a door, held open by a grandfather who had walked into the old country and walked back out with the impossible folded under his arm like a newspaper. On the 4th day, Abe's face came through on the bureau line instead, and Harry knew before the amphibian spoke, because Abe was doing the still thing, and Harry had hated the still thing his entire life. "Harry," Abe said, and his voice came from very far down, "I need you to sit, please. And I need you to know, before I say anything else, that he was not afraid, and that he did it for you, and that he very nearly succeeded." Professor Trevor Bruttenholm, Grandpa, who had read him folklore in a chair too small for him, who had told him the truth about the splinter as a bedtime story, because that was the most honest way there was, who had spent his last weeks trying to unwrite the death sentence in his own gospel, had gone alone into the old country to a source one did not telephone, and he had not come home. Harry did not cry at first. He sat very still and held the nail until it warmed, and he asked the only question a field agent had left to ask, the one that was really a way of not screaming. "How?" "He found the thread he was looking for," Abe said gently. "He went to the oldest keeper of the oldest cachet lore in the world, a being that has hoarded the secret of deaths hidden in vessels, since before there were files to write them in. He went seeking the method to return a death to its owner without killing the vessel. And by every sign we can read from the wreckage of his notes, Harry, he got it. He learned it. He wrote down enough of it that you may yet finish what he started." A pause, the worst kind. "And then the keeper took its price. He knew it would. He went anyway. He left you a way to live, and he paid for it with the only currency that being accepts." Abe's pale eyes were wet, which Harry had not known they could be. "The being's name, Harry, is one your father has spoken in this building exactly twice in all the years I have known him, both times with a gun in his hand. It is Baba Yaga, and she has wanted a price from the house of Bruttenholm for a very long time." Harry closed his eyes. "Where's my father?" "He said—" "Gone," said Abe, and for the first time the grief cracked into fear. "He took the news, and he did not say a word, and he was off the mountain before any of us could stop him. He has gone to the old country, Harry. He has gone to the one enemy on this earth he has unfinished business with, to avenge the man who raised us both. And I am very much afraid, I have felt it, on the water, the way I feel these things, that this is precisely what she has been waiting 60 years for him to do." The hut stood on the bone-gray edge of nowhere, where the snow never melted and the trees grew with their roots in the air, and it stood on 2 enormous yellow chicken legs, and it turned slowly to face Hellboy as he came over the last white rise with grief sitting on his shoulders like a second coat and Good Samaritan heavy in his fist. He'd been here before. Once. A long time ago, with 2 good eyes between them and a grudge struck fresh. He still had both of his. She did not. "Red," said the hut, in a voice that was the witch's voice, vast and amused and patient as a glacier, the door yawning open like a mouth. "You took your time. I set the kettle on 60 years ago." "Where is he?" Hellboy said. He did not raise the gun yet. There was a part of him, the field agent part his father had drilled into him before Harry was ever born, that knew exactly what kind of place he was standing in and exactly how badly it would go, and that part was screaming at him to turn around. He ignored it. That was the thing about losing your father. It made you stupid in a way no enemy could plan for, except this one had, because this one had been planning for it since before Harry was born. "Bruttenholm, where is he, you, Eaton?" said Baba Yaga comfortably, and stepped out onto the porch of bones, and she was exactly as terrible as he remembered, iron-toothed and one-eyed and old as winter, leaning on a pestle the size of a man. Don't look like that, Red. He came to me. He knew the price of the asking, and he paid it gladly, which is more than I can say for most. He bought a boy's life with his own, and he wrote down the buying, and he died satisfied, knowing his grandson might walk out of his own skull alive. Her single eye glittered. It was the best death I've taken in 100 years. Clean, loving, I almost let him keep it, but a price is a price. And Hellboy, who had come here stupid with grief, did the thing she had waited 60 years for him to do. He raised the gun. Yes, breathed Baba Yaga, delighted. There it is. There's my eye's worth. He never even got the shot off. The snow came alive. She had seeded the whole White Valley. Every drift a snare, the oldest kind, the kind you walked into the way you walked into a fairy tale. One stupid grieving step at a time, and the trees with their roots in the air closed their fingers. And the ground that was not ground swallowed him to the waist, and Hellboy, the beast of the apocalypse, who had shrugged off collapsed cathedrals and the wrath of gods, found himself held the way only the old stories can hold a thing, completely and by his own choosing, because he had crossed her threshold of his own free will, and that was the only door her kind had ever needed. I'm not going to kill you, Red, Baba Yaga said, almost kindly, crouching at the lip of the snare to look him in his trapped and furious face. Killing you would be a mercy and a waste, and I have other plans for the apocalypse than letting it die in my garden. No, I'm going to keep you. Here, in the between place, where no instrument of your bureau can find you and no road of your world can reach you, for as long as it amuses me, which, at my age, is a very long time. She smiled her iron smile. And do you know the sweetest part, the part I have saved 60 years to taste? She leaned close. Your boy is going to need you, soon, more than he has ever needed anything. There is a thing reaching for him down the dark wire even now, and a thing of mine circling him besides, and at the worst hour of his short life he is going to reach for his father, and his father will not come. That is my eye's worth, Red, not your death, your absence. At the one moment it costs the most. Hellboy stopped struggling. He went very still, the way Harry went still, the way they had taught each other, and he looked up at the one-eyed witch out of the snare she'd built from his own grief, and he did not beg, and he did not rage, because neither would move her and both would please her. He just said, quiet and level and entirely certain, the dangerous voice, the last second before something breaks voice that had no breaking left to do, you don't know my kid. Baba Yaga tilted her head. You think you've got him cornered, Hellboy said. Alone, scared, no father coming. You think that's the worst hour of his life and he's gonna fold. He smiled, and there was no humor in it, only a terrible faith. Lady, I raised that boy on exactly one lesson, and I drilled it into him every single morning for 16 years, and the lesson is this. You are what you do when nobody's coming to save you. You didn't take his father away from him at the worst hour. You handed him the chance to be everything his father ever taught him. You just don't know it yet, 'cause you've spent your whole long life around things that fold. His smile widened, awful and proud. He won't fold. He'll file his horns and get to work. And when this is over and he wins, 'cause he always wins, not 'cause he's strong, but 'cause he's mine, you're gonna wish you'd taken the simple revenge and shot me in the snow. For just a moment, something flickered in the witch's single eye that might, in a smaller creature, have been doubt. Then she straightened, and the hut turned its back, and the between-place folded shut around Hellboy like a closing book. And the beast of the apocalypse was gone from the world at the exact hour his son would need him most, which was precisely the price. And Baba Yaga went inside to drink her 6 years cold tea, and tried not to think about the boy. Voldemort came for Harry that night, down the wire, while the boy was still raw from the news of his grandfather and did not yet know his father was lost too. Harry felt it begin as a pressure behind the scar, the cold pulse he knew, but wrong, not the passenger reaching outward toward its brothers, but something reaching inward down the long dark connection that bound every fragment to its source. A cold intelligence pouring up the wire from somewhere far to the south, vast and patient and focused, and Harry understood with a lurch of pure animal dread exactly what was happening even as it happened. He was being visited. The main soul. The whole of the thing his fragment was a splinter of, come at last to see the accident in the nursery that had grown teeth. "Harry Potter," said Lord Voldemort into the center of his skull in a voice like a key turning in a frozen lock. "Let me look at you." And then Harry was not standing in a disused classroom in a Scottish castle. He was nowhere, a grey-between place inside his own head, the wire made into a room, and across it stood a figure he had hunted for weeks without ever seeing. Tall and thin and not quite finished, a half-made horror knitting itself back into the world. With a face that had once been a beautiful boy's and a pair of red eyes that found Harry and opened, hungry, fascinated, possessive. Extraordinary, Voldemort breathed, circling him. "I made you and forgot you. A splinter, an afterthought, lost to a dead woman's love and a backcountry protection, and look what you became." The red eyes drank him in, raised by a demon to hunt the dark, taught to turn the piece of me inside you into a blade. "You have been killing me, child, one vessel at a time, and you didn't even need a wand to do it. A cold delight. Do you understand what you are? You are the finest thing I ever made by accident. You are a part of me that learned to think, and I have come to take you back." The wire pulled. Harry felt it, felt Voldemort begin to reel him in, to draw the fragment home and the boy with it, to repossess the vessel and wear it and turn the hunter into a tool. And it was strong, far stronger than anything Harry had ever resisted. The full weight of an undivided Dark Lord against a grieving 16-year-old. And Harry felt himself sliding toward the red eyes the way the Colden's hound had pulled at Edmund. And he heard, faint and frightened, his own passenger recoil. "No, not back. I don't want to go back. I'm not yours anymore. I'm his." And for one vertiginous instant the fragment in his head and the boy it lived in were, grotesquely, allies, both of them straining away from the thing on the other end of the wire. "Let me help you," the passenger whispered, the warm, reasonable voice, the CH5 voice, the trap. "You can't hold him off alone. You're mortal, you're grieving, you're the weak link, they all said so. But together, give me the wheel just for this, just to keep us both free of him. Together we are stronger than he is. Let me drive, let me save us." And Harry, sliding, terrified, alone, with his grandfather dead, and his father he didn't yet know lost, and the most powerful dark wizard in the world reeling him in by the soul, did the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than letting the wheel go to save Edmund. Because this time letting go would have worked, this time the monster was telling the truth. This time the easy thing and the surviving thing were the same thing, and only the right thing stood apart. He refused them both. He put his hand flat over his true heart, the gesture 16 years old, drilled into him by an amphibian over a snake, by a fire starter over cocoa, by a demon over a coffee mug, whose memory was grayed and gone, and he did not reach for the fragment's offered strength. And he did not let the wire reel him home, and instead he reached for the only thing that was wholly, unmistakably, uncounterfeitably his grief, brought home in the too small chair. The story of Cachet told as a kindness. The men who write the storybooks have no love for the vessel. The white-knuckled hands on the secure line. I never imagined I was writing the death warrant of my own grandson. The recorded joy, "I'll come home." The grief came up in Harry like a flood, hot and human and enormous. A love so specific and so wounded that it had edges, that it had a name, and Harry seized it and held it up between himself and the red eyes like a torch, and Lord Voldemort, who had cut his own soul into pieces precisely so that he would never have to feel a thing like this, who had made himself a stranger to love because love was a door the dead could walk through, flinched. The reeling stopped. "What?" said Voldemort, and for the first time there was something other than appetite in the cold voice. Distaste. Almost fear. "What is that? Stop feeling that. It is," the red eyes narrowed. "It is in the way. It's grief," Harry said, and his voice in the grey room was steady, the most afraid steady, his father's steady. "It's love for a man you'd have eaten without blinking. It's the thing you cut yourself to pieces to never feel, and it's the reason you can't get a grip on me, Tom." The name landed in the grey room like cold iron through a vessel. "Don't," said Voldemort. "Tom Riddle?" Harry took a step toward the red eyes instead of away, and felt the wire's pull weaken with every syllable, felt the true name do the thing his whole family had promised it would do since he could hold a piece of chalk. Name it, and it has to answer. Half-blood. Mother named Merope. Died bringing you into a Muggle orphanage. Father a Muggle named Tom who left before you were born, who you murdered when you were 16. My age, Tom, exactly my age, because you couldn't stand having his ordinary name. You hid your death in 7 jars because you were so afraid of dying, of being ordinary, of being Tom, that you cut your own soul to ribbons rather than face it. Each word a hand on the leash, each fact a tightening, and the red eyes were not hungry now. They were furious, because the one thing the Dark Lord could not endure was to be known, to be reduced from a name that kept children awake to a frightened boy from an orphanage. You came up my wire to take me back and wear me like a coat, but you can't wear me, Tom. You don't fit. You're too small. You hollowed yourself out so there'd be nothing left to die, and now there's nothing left to fill, and a grieving 16-year-old with a head full of love is too big for you to climb inside. That's the secret nobody in either of my worlds ever told you. You didn't make yourself immortal. You made yourself empty, and empty things can't possess what's full. And Lord Voldemort, named and known and refused, recoiled, tore himself back down the wire in a fury of cold, the grey room collapsing, the red eyes shrinking to points and gone. And Harry was on his knees in the disused classroom again, white breath pouring off him, blood running from his nose. The scar split and screaming, alive and himself, and entirely, finally, alone. It was Hermione who found him, again, and this time when she crossed the room and dropped to her knees beside him, he did not have the strength to warn her off the cold. And she did not need warning, because she had stopped flinching weeks ago. Somewhere around the night she learned to shout, "Which voice is yours?" He came, Harry said, into her shoulder. "Tom, down the wire." He tried to take me back, turn me into his, and the thing in my head offered to help me fight him, and it was telling the truth, Hermione, together we'd have won, and I said no to both of them. I held the wheel myself, and he was shaking. I named him, and it worked. The name worked. He couldn't stand being Tom. I beat the most powerful dark wizard in the world with a name and a feeling, and I have never been so frightened in my life. "You won," she said. "I lost everything," Harry said, and then it came, finally, the grief breaking all the way through, 16 years of held things giving at once. "Grandpa's dead. He died getting me the door the other way, and he went alone, and I let myself believe I'll come home because I wanted it to be true. And my father." His breath caught. "Abe said he went after her, after Baba Yaga, to avenge Grandpa, and I haven't heard from him, Hermione, and I know the way you know a dream's going bad before it does. I know he's not coming back either. They took both of them, the grandfather and the father, in 1 week. And I'm 16, and I'm alone in a castle full of strangers with 3 more pieces of a Dark Lord to hunt, and the last one's behind my own eyes, and there is no one left to save me." Hermione held him while he wept and did not tell him it would be all right, because she was too honest for that, and he would have hated her for it. She just held on. And when the worst of it had passed, when he had cried himself empty and quiet and was only breathing, she said, gently, the truest thing anyone had said to him since the mountain. "No one's coming to save you. You're right. So the only question left is the one you've been raised your whole life to answer." She drew back and looked at him, fierce and wet-eyed and certain. "What kind of weapon are you going to be? Because there's a thing in your head right now, isn't there, murmuring that it could fix all of this. Bring your father back. Avenge your grandfather. Burn Tom Riddle out of the world. All you have to do is stop holding the wheel so tightly. I can see it on your face. It's offering. It's been offering this whole time." Her hand found his over his heart. "So choose, right now while I'm watching. The fragment or the door? The crown or the chalk? Tell me which weapon you're going to be, Harry Potter, and then we get up off this floor and we be it." And Harry Potter, orphaned twice in a week, alone 16, with the most reasonable voice in the world whispering that it could give him back everything he'd lost if he'd only let it drive, reached out, not for the fragment. He reached past Hermione to the bag he carried everywhere, and he drew out two things and set them on the cold stone floor between them in the lamplight. The first was a sheaf of papers, water-stained and blood-stained and written in a dead man's careful hand, Bruttenholm's last notes, the thread to the other way, incomplete, paid for with a life and a love. The second was a stub of white chalk. "This kind," Harry said. He picked up the chalk, and his hand had stopped shaking, and behind his split and aching scar the passenger went quiet and cold, and, for the first time in 16 years, a little afraid, because it had watched the boy at the worst hour of his life, with every door of escape standing open. Look straight at the crown it was offering and choose, instead, the patient, ugly, mortal work of a man who knew his own name. "Help me finish what he started," Harry said to Hermione, and spread his grandfather's blood-stained notes across the floor and weighted the corners with a horseshoe nail and a knitted stag. "We've got 3 jars left out there and 1 in here, and a method that's still missing half its words. Grandpa got us most of the way to the door." He looked up at her, and there was something new in his face, something his father would have recognized and been proud of and been afraid of in equal measure, the look of a boy who had finally, fully, become the thing he'd been raised to be. "Let's go build the rest of it ourselves,"